Thunderbird Gold by Nathanael Reed. The 5 Canoes. A light mist rose from the Grassy river, shrouding its shoreline in hazy blue shadows. 5 birch-bark canoes slid silently downstream, driven by bronze-skinned warriors. They wore buckskin, their faces were streaked with paint, and their hair was cut sternly in the fashion of the Iroquois. As their canoes rounded a sharp bend in the twisting river, a sheer rock precipice emerged before them, rising from the waters and towering overhead. One of them pointed his paddle to a spot partway up the 30-foot cliff, and then navigated his canoe closer to the bluff, as if to study the bright red pictures painted there. The leader of the war party stirred uneasily as they drifted slowly up to the rocks. He eyed the opposite riverbank. It was not normal for a forest to be so quiet, and there was something else. These paintings did not look at all like others he had seen. They appeared newer, much newer, almost as if they had been painted the day before. Suddenly the rocky ledge was alive with screaming men, and huge boulders hurtled down over the precipice. The chief shouted, attempting to turn his canoe, but the men above rained deadly arrows upon him and his companions. An Ojibwa trap. Within the space of a few frantic heartbeats, all the Iroquois had perished. Quickly the Ojibwa warriors pulled the dead warriors and the remains of their canoes from the water and dragged them to the other side of the narrow river. There they stripped the bodies of their valuables and buried them. Thus, in the summer of 1815, a small band of Iroquois warriors met an unremarked end. But for the Ojibwa people of the Grassy River, the ripples of this brief encounter would reverberate for the next 200 years. Chapter 1. The Northlander. For crying out loud, that's 3 times this week. The station master stormed across the train platform in front of Eric. 3 times in 1 week. How can we expect to keep this railway going when the train's late every second day? He opened the front of his large gold pocket watch and held it up to the light of a nearby street lamp. 9:30, almost dark, and the train's not even in yet. The big man snapped the cover shut and squinted down at Eric. Who are you expecting? My cousin from Toronto, Eric stammered. Calvin McBride. He's coming up for the summer to help out around the lodge. The station master gestured toward the vehicle Eric had parked near the tracks and smiled briefly. Now don't go showing off on that all-terrain vehicle of yours. Your cousin's probably never even seen an ATV before. Eric returned the station master's smile, pulling his jacket collar up closer to the bottom of his ears. Cools off quickly up here, don't it? The man said. Eric followed the station master's eyes down the tracks to where the overdue Northlander passenger train would shortly make its appearance. 350 miles of steel rails stretched all the way southward from this little Northern Ontario railway station to Toronto. He felt the station master's eyes on him again. How's your dad getting along? The big man asked in his gruff voice. That was quite an accident he had. He's improving, Eric answered. He's supposed to get out of the hospital in a couple of weeks. Reckon you'll be glad for your cousin's help then. Tough thing for your mom and you to run a tourist resort by yourselves. The doors to the railway station's waiting room banged open, and 2 men dressed in tan-coloured trench coats hurried onto the platform. Toronto train in yet? One of the men flashed a piece of police identification. Not yet, it's late as usual. We just got word there may be someone coming in on the Northlander that we're interested in, said the other officer. There she is now, the station master said, as a long, mournful whistle drifted through the night air toward them. A moment later, the huge, hissing locomotive rolled slowly past the platform, dragging 3 brightly lit passenger cars to a noisy stop. Stay back from the train, one of the policemen warned. Eric watched as the conductor helped an elderly lady down the stairs and onto the platform. She was followed by another older woman and then by a man in a business suit. Eric glanced anxiously through the large windows of the passenger cars. That was it? Weren't any more passengers getting off? Had Calvin missed the train? "We're going to take a look. Hold the train." The two policemen brushed past the conductor and climbed into the train. Now what's going on down there? The station master tossed his clipboard onto a nearby baggage cart and stomped off in the direction of the train's locomotive. Eric followed him down the track to the engine, where the train's fireman and a man in a business suit stood looking upward at the cab. "Look out below!" The engineer leaned out the small window above their heads and dropped a suitcase onto the platform. At the same time, another person swung himself out of the cab and began to descend the steel ladder. As the engineer's guest jumped the final few feet to the platform, the station master sputtered angrily. "I thought passengers weren't allowed in the engine anymore." "Hey, Eric!" Eric almost toppled over. "Calvin!" His blonde-haired cousin grabbed him by the arm and began pumping it up and down. Finally, he turned back to the engineer's cab. "Thanks a lot, Mr. Turner. I really enjoyed my ride." The engineer waved and pulled his head back out of sight. "And thank you too, Dr. Schmidt," Calvin added, extending his hand to the tall, dark-haired man standing beside him. "Sure appreciate you arranging for me to ride in the engine." "My pleasure, Calvin," said the man. "Eric, this is Dr. Schmidt," Calvin continued. "Dr. Schmidt was my seatmate on the trip up. He got me the ride in the engine." "It was nothing, Calvin," Dr. Schmidt said. "You made a long train trip more interesting. Besides, the engineer is an old friend. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd better run." The doctor's eyes shifted from the boys to the station master and then back again. "Perhaps I shall see you around town. I expect to be here for a week or two." He headed across the platform to the taxi parked beside the station. "Nice man." Calvin grinned as he scooped up his suitcase. "He's a geologist, some kind of mining executive from Montreal. I'll tell you about him later." The station master led the way back down the tracks to the station just as the two policemen emerged from the passenger cars. "No luck, I see," he observed. "Nah, bum tip, I guess. Conductor wasn't much help either." A short blast of the engine's whistle signaled the train back to life, and the huge locomotive continued its ponderous journey into the growing darkness. "Who were you looking for?" Calvin asked the policeman as the train disappeared into the night. "Oh, just a certain character we thought might be dropping by." "What did he do?" "Well, nothing that would make the tabloids, but he is a bad one." "Is he wanted?" Calvin asked. The policeman turned to get a better look at Calvin, his eyes dropping to the suitcase standing between them on the platform. "I didn't see you get off the train." "Well, no. I rode in the engine for the last half hour." "You rode in the engine? Do they allow that?" "Well, maybe they don't. But I had special permission. Dr. Schmidt knew the engineer." "Dr. Schmidt?" "He was my seatmate. I rode with him all the way from Toronto." "He's still on the train, then?" "The doctor got off here," the station master answered. "He was riding with the boy in the engine." "What did this guy look like?" The station master scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Tall, well-dressed fellow with dark hair. On the thin side. Speaks with a bit of an accent." "German?" "Must have been with a name like Schmidt, but he really didn't sound German." "Where'd he go?" "He grabbed a taxi into town," Eric said. "You're not interested in Dr. Schmidt, are you?" Calvin asked. "Who knows, son?" "We just might be." The policeman glanced down at his watch. "Well, we've got to go. It's getting late." Calvin stared after the two policemen as they hurried from the platform. "Couldn't be interested in Dr. Schmidt," he finally said. "The doctor's an important guy. Even the conductor seemed to know him." Eric picked up Calvin's suitcase and led him over to where he had parked his all-terrain vehicle. A nearby streetlight picked up the fine, smooth lines of the machine. The two-seat ATV resembled both an overblown four-wheeled tricycle and a motorbike, with two wide wheels in front and two even larger ones behind. Calvin ran his hand over the red metal and felt the leather seats. "What is this?" "It's an ATV, an all-terrain vehicle," Eric explained. "It's got a motorcycle engine under the seat, and those big wheels will let it go through bush, swamps, or snow. It almost never gets stuck. And best of all, if you don't run it on the highways, you don't need a regular driver's license." Calvin walked around the machine, studying it carefully. "A real beaut. Is it yours?" "Sort of. Dad bought it to use around the lodge, but he hasn't been able to drive it since his accident, so I get to—" Calvin put his suitcase onto the rack behind the seats, and Eric fastened it down with a couple of straps. "I was sorry to hear about your dad being in the hospital," Calvin said. "Thanks. He'll be out in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, it'll be good to have you helping out around the lodge." He tossed his cousin a helmet with a bright red maple leaf emblazoned on its side, and the two boys climbed aboard. Eric pulled an ignition key from his jacket pocket and quickly brought the machine roaring to life. "We're off!" he yelled above the motor. "How far to the lodge?" "Only about 20 minutes. Hold on." Eric accelerated down the vacant street before veering off onto a bush trail at the edge of town. The headlight of the ATV lit up the trees on either side of them as they flashed by. Calvin clutched the leather seat strap in front of him and leaned toward his cousin. "This is going to be a great summer," he yelled above the roar of the motor. Chapter 2. Willis. Calvin pulled his head deeper into the mass of warm, heavy quilts. The cool morning air made his comfortable bed even more inviting, especially after yesterday's long train ride and late night. He rolled over and stared up at the ceiling of the small bedroom. "Funny thing," he thought, "hundreds of miles from home, and the first thing I think about is what I tried to leave behind." His mother's voice echoed inside his head. "This trip up north is really perfect, Cal. Perhaps while you're away, your father and I will be able to work things out." He shuddered and curled deeper into the warm quilt. Divorce. What an ugly word. He pulled the quilt up over his head, feeling suddenly lost and alone. "Cal, are you awake?" Eric croaked from across the small bedroom. Calvin slowly lifted his head and tugged an arm loose so he could read his wristwatch. 6:15. On the other side of the room, his cousin was sitting up in bed, blankets pulled high around his shoulders. "Calvin, hear that?" He strained his ears to listen. From the main floor beneath them, he could hear faint shufflings and stirrings, the sounds of a wood stove being stoked and breakfast being made. Aunt Helga making breakfast? "No, outside, listen." Calvin turned his face to the small window on the far wall. Muffled voices and the distant thrum of a boat's outboard motor drifted into their room. A wide smile creased Eric's face. "That's got to be the two archaeologists I was telling you about last night, the ones that are staying here." He threw back the covers and bounced across the floor to the window. Calvin swung his feet over the edge of the bed and shuffled across the room to where his cousin was standing. "Look," Eric said. A blanket of fog shrouded the lake's surface, obscuring all objects beyond 100 yards or so. "There they are." Eric pointed to the end of a long wooden dock. Calvin could tell it was a cold morning just by the way the two people on the dock were bundled up. The shorter of the two was dancing from one foot to the next, banging his hands together for warmth. The taller person stood with arms folded tightly in front, staring out onto the lake. "The tall, lanky one with the straight back is Mrs. Tulloch," Eric said with a chuckle. "They're waiting for Willis. He's taking them over to the Grassy River this morning to look at some rock paintings." "Willis?" "Yeah, Willis guides a bit for some of the hunters and fishermen that stay here. His people are Ojibwa. He's a little older than us, about 18 or so. A real nice guy. There he is now." As Eric spoke, A bright green canoe with a small outboard motor broke through the fog, its nose pointed toward the dock. Eric began struggling into a pair of jeans. "Let's get going. Willis will stop in here for a coffee before he heads out." Calvin pulled the thickest sweater he could find out of his still unpacked suitcase. Downstairs, Aunt Helga greeted them from the kitchen counter, where she was up to her elbows in a basin of dough. "Morning, sleepyheads." Calvin smiled. "Morning, Aunt Helga." "I guess we stayed up a bit too late last night talking," she said. "I'm feeling a little woolly-brained." "Willis is here," Eric said, moving over to inspect the sizzling frying pan on top of the stove. "I heard his boat," Aunt Helga replied. "And those two from the university should be in for breakfast any minute. Help yourself to some bacon. The eggs are keeping warm in the oven." Eric swung the oven door open and, with the help of 2 thick oven mitts, removed a large platter of fried eggs. Calvin gave his aunt a kiss on the cheek. Funny how he'd remembered his aunt as being taller, but for the most part she looked the same as when she'd visited them in Toronto 2 summers ago. Her pleasant round face, her dark hair done up in a bun, her ever-present smile. The coffee should be just about ready. Aunt Helga wiped the flour from her arms and poured 3 steaming mugs. Calvin sat down at the kitchen table, enjoying once again the warmth of the wood stove. The dining area was the lodge's second largest room, with a rustic homemade table running almost its length and a huge staircase on the far end. He knew, from his brief tour the previous evening, that an equally large living room took up the other half of the main floor. Eric's family and their guests stayed upstairs in the living quarters. The 2 people Calvin had seen down on the dock burst through the front door and stumbled into the kitchen. "Shiver me timbers," the shorter of the 2 guests said in a loud voice, banging his mittened hands together. "It's cold enough out there to freeze a man solid." "Oh, come now, John. This is northern Ontario. We didn't expect palm trees and southern breezes," said his wife. "But it's almost July." "Don't worry," Aunt Helga said. "The day will warm up very quickly." It was only as the door closed that Calvin noticed the 3rd person who entered the lodge. Calvin swiveled in his chair to get a better look at the man crossing the floor toward him. Willis Hamilton was tall, with the lean physique of someone who knew what hard work was all about. His black hair and dark skin were dominated by a handsome face, set off by a pair of large, expressive eyes. He was dressed in rough bush clothes and carried a canvas pack in one hand. "Well, well, up already, Eric, me lad," the newest arrival said with a wide grin. Calvin thought he detected an Irish accent. "And this must be Calvin for sure," Willis said, reaching across the table to give Calvin's hand a firm shake. Aunt Helga moved over to the table with the coffee pot. "Oh, Willis, stop teasing with that accent." "To be sure. Come from a small reservation just north of Belfast. Me pappy did." Coffee. The 2 archaeologists spoke in unison and hurried over to the table. "Yes, and I have bacon, eggs, and toast as well. Or oatmeal, if you prefer," said Aunt Helga. "No, bacon and eggs are fine," answered Mrs. Tulloch. "Need our energy for the day's adventure, won't we?" her husband said with a grimace, looking over his shoulder as Aunt Helga returned with a tray of plates loaded with food. "Ah, that we will," Willis said. "Eric and Calvin, allow me to introduce our guests, Doctors of Archaeology from the University of Toronto, John and Barbara Tulloch." The boys reached across the table to shake their hands. "I've met our guests," Eric said with a smile. Barbara Tulloch was younger than Calvin had first supposed, with a friendly, nervous smile and a wild-looking head of dark hair. John, on the other hand, exhibited such fierce energy that Calvin found himself smiling as he watched the balding professor cramming his mouth with bacon and eggs. "How's your father doing, Eric?" Willis asked. "Not bad, thanks. The doctors think he'll have to stay in the hospital for about another 2 weeks. He telephones every other day to make sure everything here is running smoothly. He just tried to do too much before his leg was properly healed, Aunt Helga said, returning to her dough kneading. Well, that's the kind of guy he is, Willis said with a smile. Got to tie him down. I expect you're glad to have young Calvin around this summer to help out. For sure, and to enjoy his company. And now there might even be someone around here that can carry his own half of the conversation, Willis said, grinning at Eric. So, how long to get to the Grassy River, Willis? John Tulloch asked, washing down the last of his breakfast with a large swallow of coffee. We should be going soon, I expect. Well, now let's see. Willis pushed himself back from the table, squinted at the clock on the wall, then winked at Eric. You'll notice I never carry a watch. Too civilized. Force myself to rely on nature to keep track of time, the sun, the shadows, other people's watches. We will have to leave soon, though, if you want to get a start on those rock paintings today. Rock paintings? Calvin echoed. Yes, Barbara Tulloch said. John and I are doing research on native Canadian rock paintings, pictographs. The other day we came across a newspaper article mentioning rock paintings on the Grassy River near here. Pictographs that have never been written up in detail. Our project is to do a complete documentation of them over the next week. And my job is to get the professors safely there and set up, Willis added, studying the clock again. It's about a 2-hour drive from here to the Grassy River itself, and then another 2 hours of serious canoeing to reach the rock paintings. Barbara Tulloch glanced at her watch. If we leave now, we should be at the site before noon. Good, good. Her husband slapped his hand on the table and got to his feet. Mrs. Tulloch looked up from her half-finished bacon and eggs. Let's get going, he urged. The morning's half gone. Willis rolled his eyes in Eric and Calvin's direction as he wiped his mouth with a napkin. Then he paused, as if struck by a thought. Say, how would you guys like to come with us? We could use the help. The Tullochs have tons of equipment. Calvin's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Go with Willis and the Tullochs. What an adventure that would be. It is Saturday after all, Willis continued, turning to Aunt Helga. Tell you what, Helga. I know how short-handed you are around here, and you'd probably even miss these 2 poor excuses for a whole day, so I'll come by next week and help out a bit to make up for it. Oh, don't be silly, she said. Of course the boys can go. We can't very well put Calvin to work the very second he gets here. Go ahead. Great. Eric pushed himself back from the table. Now wait just a minute, John Tulloch said, his big face turning redder by the second. We don't have the money to pay 2 more people, and we won't have room in our canoes. Willis patted the professor on the shoulder. Don't worry, Doc. These guys don't eat much. I'll give them each a trinket or 2 for their troubles, and they'll be as happy as anything. He winked again at the boys. Besides, you'll appreciate their help when it comes to lugging all that equipment of yours and helping to paddle those 2 big canoes. Where exactly are you going? Calvin asked. Well, the Grassy River used to be an important waterway through these parts, but over the years it has dwindled down to just a bit more than a creek. We can reach the Grassy by driving over to a beach and then paddling up the river to those pictograph cliffs. We should be there by noon. Why are we going by canoe? Eric asked. Can't we take a couple of Dad's outboard motors? Good thought. Except the Grassy River is generally so shallow and loaded with deadheads, it would wreck an outboard. It's a lot easier just to paddle our way in there. One other thing. I hope you guys won't mind if we stop on the way back to visit my old granddad. He lives near Amich, and I haven't seen him for a while. That would be nice, Willis, Aunt Helga said with a smile. Well, fine, John Tulloch agreed. But we'd better get a move on. We still have to load our stuff, and it's going to take half the day to get there as it is. I'd like to have a good look at those paintings while there's still light out, and we've got only a week. Oh, relax, John. His wife rose from her seat with a patient smile. A week should be plenty of time to make a study of the paintings. Fine. The professor pushed his chair in under the table with a bang. I just don't want Schmidt beating us in there, that's all. Calvin jerked around to look at the professor. Dr. Schmidt? He asked. Willis looked over at him, then back to John Tulloch. Tulloch frowned. You know him? Couldn't be the same guy, Calvin said. I met a Dr. Schmidt on the train, said he was a geologist. Well, if it's the same guy, he's no geologist and he's no doctor either. In fact, Schmidt isn't even his real name. He's a grave-robbing cutthroat, a man who's gotten wind of this project, and he'll stop at nothing. Barbara Tulloch's hand was suddenly on her husband's arm, pulling him toward the door. Now, John, let's not get into all of that. The boys aren't interested, I'm sure. Eric glanced at Calvin. Calvin felt his face growing hot as he caught a glimpse of Willis's frown. Couldn't be the same Dr. Schmidt as the man on the train, he thought. Couldn't be. Or could it? People of the River. The summer of 1815 was one of the hottest that the old people of the river could remember. Even now, as autumn approached, the days were almost unbearable and the evenings uncomfortably warm. It was after such a day, and on such an evening, that the men and women of this small Ojibwa band gathered around their campfires on the banks of the Grassy River. The flames cast eerie reflections on the assemblage of teepees stretching into the darkness behind them. The people sat with blankets draped about their shoulders despite the warmth of the evening. In the distance they could hear the gentle lapping of the river against the sandy shore. This day had been one that would live forever. It was a day to be spoken of and described to their children and their children's children, for it had been a day of the Ojibwa's greatest triumph over the hated Iroquois. Finally, Chief Pemujega broke the silence. He must be the one to bring the day into words, so he pushed aside the blanket that covered his frail shoulders and rose to his feet. Our enemies, the Iroquois, are dead, he said in their native tongue. Today has surely brought to an end their raiding parties and their cruel warriors. Their canoes will no longer reach into our lands to kill and steal. He paused, reaching for the proper words. But this great victory has left us with important decisions to be made. The others around the fire nodded their approval. For too long we have stood by helplessly as our enemies have plundered our land, the land of our ancestors. But because of one man, our brother Megauso, this nightmare has come to an end. The chief's solemn face lightened momentarily as the others again murmured their approval. He glanced across the fire to Megauso, the community's medicine man. The old chief continued, Who else but our brother Megauso, with his clever ways, would have thought to put the rock pictures on the cliff near here? Only he would know how these pictures would lure the canoes of our enemies, making them as curious as little children. Who else but Megauso could have planned the ambush and imagined its success? Chief Pemujega looked around him at the men and women who encircled the fire. These were old faces, the tired faces of a people he had known since childhood. Slowly he collected his thoughts. There are some who say that the rock paintings of the past are sacred, that such paintings should not be spoken of, and that by drawing new ones we mocked our ancestors and their beliefs. But surely what has happened today will be spoken of for many generations. This, too, is a sacred thing. Again there was a stirring around the fire. The people watched as their chief slowly sat down and pulled his blanket around him. Like their aging chief, they became lost in thought. Surely this was a sacred occasion, and their victory would be remembered for generations. But now, important decisions must be made. What was to be done with the riches that had been found in the Iroquois canoes? What could such a treasure mean to the people of the river? What were they to do now? These questions weighed on the minds of all the people on that dark summer night. Chapter 3. The Rock Paintings. The trip to Amiche reminded Calvin of his most recent roller coaster ride. The narrow road had so many bends and hairpin turns that sometimes Willis's truck seemed to be travelling in circles. Calvin and Eric were given the responsibility of checking the road behind them to make sure that the professor's camper van was still in sight. As Willis had predicted, in just under 2 hours, he led the small convoy through the tiny village of Amiche, and then onto a narrow dirt road leading to the Grassy River. The vehicles slowed to a crawl as the drivers cautiously maneuvered down the narrow bush trail, grimacing each time the branches scraped against the sides of their vehicles. 10 minutes brought them to the sandy banks of the little Grassy River. "All hands on deck," Willis said as they piled out of the truck. "Let's get this stuff unloaded." The trailer behind the Tulloch's camper van was crammed with canoes and equipment and covered by a heavy tarpaulin. Willis glanced up at the sky. "Looks like rain," he said, pulling several light raincoats from behind the seat of his truck. Hurriedly, they began moving the canoes and supplies down to the riverbank. When the last piece of equipment was finally loaded aboard the 2 canoes, Willis, Eric, and Barbara Tulloch climbed gingerly into one, while Calvin and the professor manned the second. "This river doesn't look so bad," John Tulloch said, edging out from the shore. "You sure we couldn't have used outboard motors?" "Not worth the risk," Willis replied. "This river is just too shallow, and the weeds are so thick they'll foul an outboard's propeller." He waved at the remains of the ancient forest protruding here and there above the surface of the river. "As you can see, the water's filled with all sorts of deadheads and stuff, mostly just below the surface. Besides," he added with a grin, "paddling is good exercise, and leaving the outboards at home means 2 less things to carry on our portage." The sky above them continued to darken as the canoes slipped along the narrow, winding river. At most points, the river was only as wide as a meandering 2-lane highway, and everyone had to be on watch for floating deadheads. Both river banks were lined with tall stands of pine, cedar, and birch trees. They crowded the shoreline, leaning out over the water and forming a great canopy. What a silence, Calvin thought. He was grateful to be able to clear his mind of everything but the sound of dipping paddles and the occasional chirp of a faraway bird. Willis pulled his canoe alongside Calvin's and motioned ahead of them. "We've got about an hour before we get to the main tributary, the Big Grassy. From there it's about half an hour. Our only portage is about 10 minutes from here." John Tulloch nodded his head approvingly. "Good, good. We should reach the paintings before lunch. We'll be able to set up our tent and get our equipment out of the rain when it comes." "It's getting a lot windier," Barbara Tulloch agreed. "Yes, and we'd better hope that wind dies down before we start back," Willis muttered. "It's at our backs now, but when we return, we'll be paddling against it." The portage was on a stretch of river strewn with fallen trees, stumps, and an abandoned beaver dam. "Can't paddle through this mess, so we'll hike around it," Willis explained as they beached their canoes and began unloading the supplies. "I thought our portage would be around some rapids or a beautiful waterfall," Barbara Tulloch said with a laugh. "Just imagine," Eric grunted as he hoisted one end of the heavy canoe onto his shoulders. Fur traders, explorers, early Hudson Bay Company men all walked this same path, carrying their canoes and supplies. "I guess the last couple of 100 years hasn't brought as much progress as we might think." "Yeah," Willis said with a grin. "And don't forget that my people were lugging stuff along this trail hundreds of years before that." Calvin felt the edges of the canoe dig into his shoulders. Surely their shoulders couldn't have ached as much as his did. When they reached the far end of the portage, they launched their canoes. A light drizzle began to fall. "Isn't it funny how a little rain can change the whole atmosphere?" Eric said. "Only a moment ago everything seemed interesting and exciting. Now it looks so bleak and empty." Calvin nodded. Eric was right. His mind darted back to his home and his parents. Had his dad moved out yet? Perhaps there was a chance that his folks could patch things up. Maybe things were back to normal already. He shook his head and looked down at the reddened palms of his hands. His knees, too, were already stiff and aching. The big Grassy. Willis was pointing his paddle beyond the bend of the narrow, cluttered stream to a larger river stretching before them. "Big," Calvin said, his brow wrinkling. "Big is in the eye of the beholder," Willis answered in a voice loud enough for the people in both canoes to hear. "Reminds me of an uncle of mine who came to visit from another village. I couldn't figure out why he was called Big Pete, because he only came up to my nose. I thought people were just being sarcastic until I visited his village. Well, compared to almost everyone else in his village, Pete was big." "You made that up," Barbara Tulloch said with a laugh as their canoes turned into the waters of the larger river. The final stretch of their journey gave Calvin an opportunity to study the tree-lined banks of the big Grassy. "Boy," he muttered, "sure aren't many places for rock paintings along this stretch." "Yech." Eric adjusted his kneeling position in the front of the canoe. "I'm soaked. There's at least 2 inches of water in here." Their canoes rounded another bend in the river, and a high rocky outcropping loomed before them. Calvin let out a whoop, raising his paddle in the air. "Thought we'd never get here, I'll bet," Willis said. "For sure." The 2 professors stopped paddling and began studying the rock face intently as they drifted toward it. The cliff rose straight out of the water, about 2 stories high and half a block long. A number of scrawny pine trees leaned over the edge of the precipice. "Where are the paintings?" John Tulloch asked, annoyance in his voice. "I can't see them. Is this the right place?" Willis rested his paddle across the gunwale of the canoe, then pointed at a flat section of grey rock above their heads. "Look, my children, the Grassy Rover Art Gallery." Calvin squinted through the drizzle to a section of the cliff that was sheltered by a small shelf. "The sun has to be just right," Willis explained. "Otherwise they're pretty hard to see." Sure enough, a paddle length above their heads, the faint outlines of a number of pictures were painted into the grey rock. John Tulloch clapped his hands together and waved his rain hat in the air. "We've done it, Barbara. We're here. We really are in uncharted waters, aren't we? This will be significant. I just know it." "If you don't tip the canoe over first," she said. "Well, we can look at all this later." Willis pointed to a small clearing just across the river from them. "Let's beach our canoes over there and get unpacking. Come on, guys." Chapter 4. Ed Hamilton. The clearing across from the rock paintings was the perfect spot for setting up camp. Tall pine and spruce trees covered the small point of land jutting out into the river, providing a soft carpet of needles for the campers. Within the hour, Willis and the boys had pitched the professor's tent and stowed most of their supplies in the back of the large tent. The rain began to let up, and as the sky cleared, Calvin's spirits began to rise. "How old do you think the paintings are?" he asked. "No way of knowing for sure," John Tulloch answered. "But once we've had a chance to study them, we should have a rough idea." "I wonder what they're supposed to mean," Calvin said as he unloaded the last duffel bag from his canoe. "Just think, a couple of 100 years ago, someone was sitting in a canoe over there painting up a storm." "Yeah, and a bunch of critics were probably sitting around offering suggestions," Willis said with a laugh. The rain came to a complete stop as the last piece of equipment was piled inside the shelter. Calvin unsnapped his raincoat and surveyed the wilderness around them. The warm, southerly breeze felt good on his face, a pleasant change from the drizzle they'd had to put up with for a good part of the morning. John Tulloch peeled off his raincoat. "I just hope we didn't forget anything important. It's a long way to anywhere from here." His wife emerged from the tent with a large plastic bag. "I guess we'll be eating from our laps for a while." she said, handing out sandwiches to everyone. John Tulloch took a huge bite of his bologna sandwich. Before you head back, Willis, have you ever heard any stories about the origin of those paintings? Willis grinned at the curious faces surrounding him. No, we hunt moose in this area, though, and I've often wondered about the pictographs. He paused over one of his sandwiches. I'll tell you what, when we stop by to see my grandfather on the way home, I'll ask him about the paintings. He may know something. Good, good. You'll be back to pick us up in 1 week's time, then? Saturday noon, Willis agreed with a nod. Saturday noon, John Tulloch repeated. We'll have everything packed up and ready to go. Our work should be finished by then. Hope so. Eric glanced at Barbara Tulloch. Could we borrow one of your notebooks and something to write with? He asked. I'd like to make a sketch of the pictographs before we leave. Mrs. Tulloch reached into a nearby pack sack and dug out a small, spiral-bound notebook and a pencil. Don't steal any of our thunder now, she teased. Calvin and Eric followed Willis and John Tulloch down to the river's edge. Well, let's get going, Willis said, pushing the canoe out into the water. He held the back of the craft steady while the boys jumped in. Then, with a quick wave to the professors, he gave the canoe a push and leaped over the side into the stern. Calvin studied the tall rock face across the river as they moved slowly out into the water. Willis, could we go by there and have a closer look? May as well. Willis steered over to the face of the cliff. Boy, you can barely make out the paintings anymore, Calvin said, staring at the faint pictographs. I guess they haven't really stood the test of time. Like everything else, I suppose, Willis agreed. Eric flipped open Mrs. Tulloch's notepad. Tell me what you see, Cal, he said. I'll do a little sketch and write down your description. That way we'll have something to think about later. Well, Calvin began, there seems to be a bunch of different figures painted onto the cliff. They're almost black, with some faint red highlights in places. The largest is about 1 foot tall and about half as wide. Going from left to right, we have 4 pictures of people, the last one holding a spear. Below the 4 people is a canoe. He stopped for a minute to study the remaining characters. Keep going, Eric urged. You're doing great. All right. Next, we've got something that looks like a sun, although it's smaller than the other figures, and it's down below the feet of the people instead of up above them. The last 2 or 3 pictures are completely different. Try describing them, Eric said. Well, the first one seems to be some kind of a large bird with its wings outstretched, and over its head is a big X. Beside the bird is a swirling figure, like a tornado or whirlpool or something. That's all. Eric finished scratching in his notepad, then looked up to study the pictures. What do you think, Willis? Does it tell a story? Or is it some kind of message? It sure doesn't look like someone was just showing off his art skills. Willis smiled. No, even I can paint better than that. Anyway, we'd better go. You guys can figure all this out on the way home. The trip back to the landing wasn't as bad as Calvin had expected. The wind had died to a whisper, and without the professor's equipment, the canoe was much lighter. The only things he had to endure were his blistered hands, his tired muscles, and the hordes of mosquitoes that appeared after the rain. Nevertheless, it was almost 2 hours before they pulled their canoe up onto the landing where Willis had parked his truck. Calvin and Eric climbed stiffly out onto the riverbank and began massaging their shoulders. I have never felt so sore in all my life, Calvin finally managed to say. Same here, said Eric. Within minutes their canoe was tied down firmly in the back of Willis's truck, and they were bumping down the dirt road back to the highway. At last, Eric said, nudging his cousin in the ribs. Next stop, Willis's grandfather's. Maybe we can get him to rustle us up a bit of grub, Willis said. Those sandwiches didn't do much to keep a guy's belly button from rubbing on his backbone. "How far away is your grandfather's place?" Eric asked. "Not far, just the other side of a meech." "Sounds good. I'm starved too." A few hairpin turns later, they pulled out onto the paved highway, and Calvin could see a meech in the distance. "Not much of a town," Eric muttered as they passed through. "Oh, I don't know," Willis said, pointing out one of the larger buildings. "It's got a general store, a school, quite a few houses. But I know what you mean. Around here, a town isn't really civilized until it gets its own bingo hall." He winked over at Eric. On the far edge of town, Willis pulled his truck off the highway onto the narrowest dirt road Calvin had ever seen. A couple of 100 yards farther, tucked into a clearing, were a number of small houses. Some were built of logs. "Is this still part of Amish?" Eric asked. "Sort of," Willis said. "A few native families make their homes here. Kind of an unofficial Ojibwa reservation, I guess. The people are a part of the native community that lives in this general area." 2 or 3 children peered from the doorways of nearby houses as Willis parked his truck. "Pretty ragged-looking kids," Eric said. "Yes," Willis agreed. "The people here are quite poor. It's hard to get steady employment." "What do the people who live here do for work?" Calvin asked. "They're so far out in the bush." "Well, they hunt and trap, and they guide fishermen, stuff like that. But there isn't really anything here that's steady anymore. Grandad gets by with some prospecting, along with his old-age pension. Some folk have tried working in the larger centres like Kirkland Lake and Timmins, but it's been a tough go." "Too bad there aren't more jobs locally," Eric said. "That's the key," Willis agreed. "This is such a beautiful area. People love living here, but they need to be able to put food on the table." As they approached the front porch of the closest house, a large black dog got stiffly to its feet and padded down the steps toward the boys. "Howdy, Butch," Willis said, scratching the dog behind the ears. "Butch," Eric said. "Not a very Ojibwa name." "Not a very Ojibwa dog," Willis said with a grin. "Part English sheepdog, part German shepherd." Willis climbed the steps and rapped loudly on the wooden door. "Got a knock with noise. He's getting deaf." "I surely ain't." Calvin and Eric jumped at the sound of the loud voice behind them. As they turned, an ancient-looking white-haired man rounded the corner of the cabin. "Some watchdog," the old man muttered. Willis motioned to the pair of snowshoes leaning against the cabin wall. "Expecting an early winter?" Their host reached up and gave Willis a light punch on the shoulder. "What are you doing in these parts, Will?" "I thought you'd got civilization in your blood and moved off to New York or somewhere. Seen so little of you lately." He looked over at Calvin and Eric. Calvin could see that Willis's grandfather was not an especially tall man, but the breadth of his chest and shoulders was impressive, especially for one so old. A coarse thatch of white hair stood almost straight up on his head, and like Willis, his copper-coloured skin, high cheekbones and dark eyes revealed his native heritage. Calvin decided that more than anything, it was the sparkle in the old man's eyes that set off his face and made it unforgettable. "Grandad," said Willis, "I'd like you to meet a couple of friends, Eric and Calvin, from over by Kenogami. They came along to help out." "Good to meet you, fellas." The old man extended a massive right hand. "Edward Hamilton's the name. Call me Ed. Hungry? Come on inside." He led Willis and the boys into a cabin that was surprisingly bright for one built of logs. It was lighted by a huge picture window that dominated the far wall. Calvin followed him to a cluttered wooden table in the middle of the room. What a room, he thought. A tousled bed in one corner, a large wood stove in the other, and lining one wall from floor to ceiling were shelves, dozens of shelves, crowded with a multitude of books and hundreds of rock samples. "I'm glad you fellas dropped by. I was just about to put the tea on." The old man moved around to the wood stove. "Just clear away some of those rocks," he said, pointing to the table, "and tell me about your trip while I throw some grub together." He began frying ham, while Willis relayed their morning adventures. Calvin noticed the old man's brow furrow when Willis mentioned the professor's interest in the Grassy River rock paintings. "They want to know what the paintings mean?" he asked. "I told them no one knew very much about those paintings anymore, except for maybe an old codger like you." "Well, if I did, I doubt I'd tell a couple of professors from the city." "Would you tell us?" Calvin asked impulsively. Mr. Hamilton looked over at Calvin, a smile creasing his wrinkled face. "You speak what's on your mind, don't you?" he said. "He does for a fact," Willis agreed. "Almost as bad as yours truly here. Now Eric, on the other hand, he's kind of the thinker of this bunch. Got to have at least one person who thinks before he speaks." Mr. Hamilton studied his visitors for a minute, a warm smile lighting his dark eyes. Then he turned to the skillet in front of him. "Not much to tell about those rock paintings, I'm afraid," he said. "Oh, I've seen them plenty of times, but what are they supposed to mean, if anything? Who can say? Anyway, it's time for a bite to eat." He carried a large platter of fried ham, eggs, and potatoes over to the table, and Willis brought the kettle of tea and a plate of blueberry muffins. Calvin eyed the muffins hungrily. The old man lowered himself into a chair next to Willis and pulled himself up to the table. "Before we dig in, how about we thank the Lord for the food?" Calvin watched Willis and Ed Hamilton bow their heads. "We thank you, Lord, for bringing Willis and Eric and Calvin here safely, and for your provisions," said Mr. Hamilton in his deep voice. "Bless us in all that we do, we pray, and thank you for your Son, the Lord Jesus. Amen." Calvin felt awkward as he raised his head. The old man was eyeing him with a smile. "Might seem strange to you, Calvin, but we like to remember to thank the Lord for our food before every meal." He passed Calvin the platter of eggs. "I've learned the hard way to be grateful for everything the good Lord sends my way. Right, Willis?" Both boys glanced at their friend. Willis grinned, but he looked sheepish. "Never be ashamed of the Lord, Will," the old man said. "Jesus himself warned us that if we deny him before others, he'll deny us before his Father." There was an awkward silence while Willis bent his head over the thick slice of ham he was sliding onto his plate. "These eggs are great," Calvin finally managed to say. "All that paddling this morning sure got my appetite going." Eric changed the subject. Willis was saying that there isn't really much agreement on how or why the paintings came to be. That's the truth. The old man took his eyes off his grandson and stirred a large spoonful of sugar into his tea. There are several stories about how the paintings originated, very mysterious. Unlike many of the much older prehistoric rock paintings that are found in different parts of the world, these paintings are fairly recent, and they seem to be connected with the Iroquois invasions of the early 1800s. "There was a war between the Ojibwa and the Iroquois?" Eric asked. "Mostly small bands of warriors raiding back and forth. And like I said, there are many different stories about how the Iroquois might have been connected with those paintings. I've always found this puzzling. Usually stories which have been handed down from generation to generation are quite simple, but when there are several conflicting stories—" The old man's voice trailed off, and he seemed to be thinking about those stories. Calvin wondered what they were. "In fact, some of the stories are so wild they almost seem to be red herrings," Mr. Hamilton added. "It's as if the paintings are hiding something. Goodness knows what, though. I've spent some long winter evenings pondering what those pictures might mean. All for nothing so far." Calvin looked over at Eric and Willis, who were sipping on their tea and looking thoughtful. "There's got to be clues," Eric suggested. "Some way of piecing the story together." "Well, maybe. In fact, that's probably what your professor friends are up to." "Do you think they can get the whole story from just the paintings?" Mr. Hamilton nodded. Possibly, although it's likely the paintings are tied to the oral traditions of our people. On the other hand, I probably know as much about local Ojibwa culture and history as anyone, and I know those paintings like the back of my hand, but I still can't make head nor tail of what they're all about. Why would there be such an interest in the paintings all of a sudden? Eric wondered out loud. Could you tell us some of the stories you've heard? Calvin asked. Mr. Hamilton paused over his tea for a moment. Perhaps when you return to pick up the professors next weekend, you can stop in again to visit an old man. Meanwhile, I'll be racking my brain to try to remember any details about those paintings that you might find interesting. That way, maybe I can squeeze another visit out of my wayward grandson. Calvin grinned at Eric. He liked that idea. In the meantime, Willis said as he pushed himself back from the table, all we have to do now is beat Dr. Schmidt and the professors to the solution. The Moosehide Cache. Chief Pemujega dragged his canoe onto the sandy beach below the steep cliffs of the Big Grassy. 3 canoes filled with men from his village followed him. He led the group along the beach to a large length of driftwood, polished white by the pounding waves of the river. At the far end of the driftwood, where a tangle of dried branches spread across the sand, he paused and exchanged a glance with Megauso, the medicine man. Then he placed a moccasined foot against the side of the log and turned it over. Curled in a small hollow and held in place by 2 large pieces of granite lay a moose hide. The chief lifted a corner of the hide and gave it a pull, uncovering several small leather sacks and 2 muskets. Without waiting to be asked, Megauso reached down and picked up a musket. He sighted down the barrel of the gun, then checked the action. The chief lifted the other gun from the sand and handed it to one of the men behind him. Put it in the canoe. Squatting, the chief turned over one of the leather sacks. I have told you about this treasure, he said, but now it lies before you. He carefully poured the contents of the sack onto the hide. Gold coins, he said quietly. The men around him drew in their breath sharply. Finally, one of the men asked, Where did the Iroquois get such things? Perhaps they were stolen, Megauso answered. Could such riches come from near here? Another of the men shrugged. It is a long way to the lodges of the Iroquois. Surely they did not bring these from their homes. They are farmers and hunters. Megauso nodded. Our enemies could have stolen these things from a distant place before they started their journey into Anishinaabe country. The men gathered closer as the chief fingered a coin from the pile of glittering gold before them. He picked up another leather pouch and emptied its coins onto the moose hide. Then he laid a hand on the remaining sacks. So many coins must be worth the wages of a lifetime. He glanced at Megauso and shook his head. The value of this treasure is beyond my understanding. Chapter 5. Hello Again. Calvin ran his thumb across the blade of his axe and gazed at the large pile of firewood stacked against the side of the main lodge. Despite his aching shoulders and the sweat that seemed to drip from every pore of his body, it was satisfying to realize how much of his uncle's winter wood he had chopped in 1 week. The time had sped by. In 2 more days they would be heading back to the Grassy to pick up the tullocks. It would be good to see Willis again. Just then, Eric rounded the corner of the lodge, peeling off one of his dad's old shirts. He was splattered with paint from head to toe. Gotta love the weather this week, eh, Cal? He said, mopping his forehead. I finally got that cottage painted. Calvin slammed the axe into the chopping block and wiped his face with the end of his t-shirt. Feel like a Coke? Sounds good. I think my mom has some in the fridge. The hot kitchen air struck him like a great smothering hand as he entered the lodge. Hello, fellas. Thirsty? Aunt Helga looked up from the account ledgers spread out on the table before her. I'll bet you'd like something cold to drink today. Cold and long. Calvin said with a grin. "How can you work in here, Mom?" Eric asked. "It must be 1,000,000 degrees." "It is hot, isn't it?" Aunt Helga said, getting 2 Cokes from the fridge. "I've got some bread baking in the oven." Calvin chugged his drink down in a single gulp, then sagged wearily into the nearest chair. Eric did the same. "Is Willis still planning on picking up the tullocks this weekend?" Aunt Helga asked. "Yes, and thanks for letting us go with him, Mom," Eric said. "Don't forget, we'll be staying with Willis's grandfather until Sunday evening. It'll give us a chance to get a good look at those paintings and talk some more with Mr. Hamilton." "I'm taking my camera this time for some pictures," Calvin said. Eric got up from the table and returned with a large book that he'd taken from the top shelf of the kitchen cupboards. "This has a lot of really good information about rock paintings," he said. "Look at these photographs." He held the book open for Calvin and Aunt Helga. "They were taken on a lake about 100 miles south of here. Do you think these rock paintings look anything like the ones on the Grassy?" Calvin studied the pictures. "Sort of. The book also tries to interpret what the pictographs might mean. Each painting was made to communicate a message or tell a story." Aunt Helga's face perked up. "Perhaps this book can help you understand what the paintings on the Grassy mean." "It may give us a start," Eric said doubtfully. "Suppose we do find out what the rocks are saying," Calvin said. "What then? Could the paintings really be hiding a message of some kind?" "Well, one thing's for sure," Eric said. "They couldn't be hiding anything too important, not up here, but it'll be fun trying to figure it out." Aunt Helga rose from her chair. "Look, boys, why don't you take the rest of the afternoon off? You've both been working hard all week, and I'm sure you have a few things you'd like to do before heading off for the weekend." "That'd be great, Mom," Eric said. "I've been telling Calvin how big the fish are down the Blanche River. You want to try our luck this afternoon, Cal?" "Sure, as long as we don't have to walk too far. I'm bushed." "We can take the ATV. It's only a 20-minute drive as the crow flies. Come on, I'll clean up and we can get going." Eric kissed his mother lightly on the cheek. "Thanks, Mom." "Now you be careful, Eric." A few minutes later, the bright red ATV sped north toward the Blanche River, with Calvin hanging onto the back grips for dear life. The narrow dirt trail wound precariously in and out of the trees, over small craggy hills, and down through wet, marshy areas. But it was soon plain that his cousin and the trail were old friends. Eric barely let up on the throttle until they rounded a small bend and screeched to a stop a few feet from the waters of the Blanche River. The Blanche was about as wide as a 4-lane highway, but unlike the Grassy, it was deep and looked as if it had a fast current. Eric pulled the ATV up onto a point of land extending into the river and parked behind some bushes. "Nice spot," Calvin said. "Wait until you see the fish." Eric began unfastening their rods and tackle boxes from the vehicle. "It's usually great here on this little point." "Too bad we didn't have time to get some minnows before we left," he added. "Pickerel really love minnows, but these lures should do the trick." He popped the lid off the tackle box and pulled out a couple of red and white spoon-shaped lures. A moment later, he joined Calvin in the shade of a large cedar tree. When Calvin made his first cast out into the river, Eric nodded. "Don't drag your hook on the bottom. Might get snagged on a log or something." "What do I do if I get a bite?" "Give it a bit of a tug and then try not to let the line go slack. Just reel it in bit by bit." By now the afternoon sun had moved behind the trees, and a light breeze was making the river's edge a very pleasant place to be. Eric propped up his fishing rod, then pulled the rock painting book out of his duffel bag and began to browse through it. Suddenly, the rod moved in Calvin's hands. "You've got one!" Eric shouted, sliding his book back into the duffel bag. "Give it a tug, quick!" Calvin snapped the rod upward, remembering to grip the reel so the fish couldn't pull any of the line free and gain an advantage. "You sure it isn't a snag? Try reeling in a bit of line and see what happens." Calvin eased the tip of his rod downward and turned the reel handle several times. "Keep reeling. Keep it tight. You've got one." Eric reeled in his own line and grabbed the fishing net. He hovered by his cousin. "Just a little bit more. He's almost in." Eric caught Calvin's fishing line, and in one quick motion he snagged the thrashing fish with the net and held it triumphantly in the air. "Your first fish." Calvin eyed it with pride. "What kind is it?" Eric lowered the struggling fish down to eye level. The fish was long and thin, its pale green back covered with a multitude of dark spots. "Good size," Eric said. "I'd say it's about 3 pounds. That's big for this river." "What kind is it, though?" "Pike. Bony, but good eating. We'll have him for supper tonight. Maybe a few of his brothers and sisters too, if we're lucky." Eric pulled the fish out of the net and carefully worked the lure out of the pike's mouth. He attached it to a chain stringer and dropped the fish into the water. "That'll keep him fresh until we're ready to go home." Lazily, Calvin began casting his line into the water again. The river was absolutely calm in the hot afternoon, without the slightest breeze to stir its surface. His head nodded, and he felt his eyes growing heavier as the day began to catch up with him. He jerked awake at the sound of voices. Eric got to his knees to peer around the bush beside them, and Calvin followed. 2 men in a green canoe were rounding a bend in the river, paddling downriver along the far bank. Calvin could make out some of their conversation as they drew closer. "I appreciate you cutting me in on this deal," a stocky man at the back of the canoe was saying. "Real nice of you to pick me up at my cabin too." "Well, it was a good day for a canoe ride. Anyway, you came highly recommended by some friends of mine." Calvin tried to get a closer look at the speaker in the front of the canoe, but his floppy, wide-brimmed hat shielded much of his face. "We'll rent a place to stay in Kenogami tonight, then head out tomorrow to have a look at those paintings." Calvin stared intently at the man in the canoe's bow. "That looks like Dr. Schmidt," he whispered. They edged themselves farther in behind the bush, putting the leafy foliage between themselves and the river. "What did he say about paintings?" Calvin whispered. "Shh," Eric signaled. The man in the back of the canoe was still talking. "The Grassy is a couple of hours' drive from Kenogami. I've been there quite a few times. Good moose country." "Okay," agreed the other man. "You run me over there tomorrow. I've a few things to check out first, and I've got to find a new place to stay. The cops came nosing around my motel, but I gave them the slip." He turned his head slightly and looked right at the spot where Eric and Calvin were hidden. Calvin sucked in his breath sharply. "It is Schmidt," he whispered. "I think there's something in those bushes over there," Dr. Schmidt said. "Let's go by and have a look." "What do we do?" Calvin whispered. "Make a run for it. And leave my ATV. Maybe they won't see us." "It's too late. They're coming, and they know we're here." Calvin's heart pounded loudly in his chest. "Let's bluff it out. Follow me." He stood to his feet. "Howdy, Dr. Schmidt." Calvin stepped out from behind the bush, smiling. "I thought that was you." "Well, well." The doctor's face broke into a broad smile. "My young friend from the city. Hello again." He gave the boys a puzzled look. "You fellas hiding from someone?" "Nah," Calvin said, trying to keep his smile intact. "We're just fishing." "Aha." The doctor nodded, but Calvin could tell that the man wasn't convinced. He felt a coldness creeping over him. There was something disturbing about this guy that he hadn't noticed before. Finally, the big man broke the silence. "Calvin, you mentioned that your aunt runs a tourist lodge over on Lake Kenogami. Do you know if she has any vacancies?" Calvin exchanged a surprised glance with Eric. She sure does. I was by there earlier today. Looks quite private. Perhaps we'll see her about a room. He nodded to his partner. Well, we'll be seeing you boys later. He leaned toward them as the canoe pulled away from the bank. Hopefully, it'll be before you see me next time. Calvin stood rooted to the bank, waiting until the canoe had turned another bend in the river. Then he breathed a loud sigh of relief. Phew, what a close one. Yeah, too close, Eric said. Probably knows we heard them talking and doesn't like it one bit. Eric's brow creased into a puzzled furrow. Did that guy with Dr. Schmidt mention the paintings over on the Grassy? Didn't the Tullocks say that Schmidt was interested in the rock paintings? Yeah, but why would a guy like Schmidt want to look at a bunch of rock paintings? Calvin asked. Maybe he's not really a geologist after all. Maybe we ought to call the police, Eric said. Sure, and what will Schmidt do to us when he learns that we ran him out of town? Strange, Eric said. Why is everyone so interested in those rock paintings all of a sudden? Makes you wonder, doesn't it? It sure does, and if Schmidt stays with us at the lodge, he can keep an eye on us. And us on him, Eric said with a grin. Come on, let's get that fish of yours into a frying pan and forget about rock paintings and strange geologists, at least until after dinner. Chapter 6. Back to the Grassy. Saturday morning ushered in the hottest, sunniest day of early summer. The perfect day for our return trip down the Grassy River, Calvin thought, except that we're all worried about the Tullocks. Beautiful weather, Willis said, contemplating the clear blue sky between paddle strokes. Hard to believe the forecast is calling for rain. Calvin smiled at him, grateful for a break in the uneasy silence. A couple more bends of the river, and we'll be where we dropped off the Tullocks, Willis added. Why wasn't their van back at the landing? Eric asked for the third time, more to himself than anyone else. Do you think it could have been stolen? Calvin slowed his paddling. They wouldn't have paddled out to their van during the week and left, would they? Maybe they had an emergency, Eric suggested. Could be that one of them got hurt or sick and they had to leave suddenly. Yeah, but you'd think that once they got out to civilization, they'd have phoned us or something to let us know what happened, Calvin said. They knew we'd be coming in for them today. That's why I'm wondering if someone stole their van, Eric said. Well, it sure is mysterious, all right, Willis agreed. But we should find our answers shortly. We're almost there. A faint smile crossed Eric's face. Anyway, it's going to be a fun weekend. Never mind the Tullocks or Dr. Schmidt or whatever his name is. I'm looking forward to taking some pictures of those rock paintings. Yeah, Calvin added. It should be interesting to find out what your grandfather thinks about the pictographs, Willis. Never dull around that old guy, Willis said. He rested his paddle on the gunwales of the canoe. Just one thing. Could Schmidt have come in here yesterday? Could be, Eric said. He and that other guy checked into our lodge the night before last, but then they left again sometime yesterday. The same guy you saw him with on the Blanche River? Yes, sounded like Schmidt hired him as a guide. I wonder if they're already here, Calvin said. Willis dipped his paddle back into the water. We'll find out right about now, I guess. As they rounded the final bend of the big Grassy River, the steep cliffs loomed out of the water to their right. Willis steered the canoe toward the small point of land across from the rocks, the place where they had left the Tullocks. Let's check on the campsite first, he said. Looks like the Tullocks' tent is still where we left it, but I don't see their canoe. Sure is quiet, Calvin muttered. With a few strong paddle strokes, Willis and the boys drew their canoe to within a few feet of the shoreline. They stepped into the shallow water and pulled the craft up onto the sand. John! Barbara! Willis called out. Calvin and Eric followed him up the beach into the clearing. Good grief, Calvin said. What went through here? A tornado? Pieces of clothing, equipment, cooking utensils, and sheets of paper were strewn everywhere. Even the back of the Tulloch's tent had collapsed into a crumpled heap. Willis stuck his head inside the tent, looked around for a few seconds, and then pulled it back out. Worse in there. Well, the Tullochs are long gone, that's for sure, Eric said. They must have taken their canoe to the landing and left in the van, Calvin said. Willis returned from checking behind the tent and stood with his arms folded across his chest, surveying the scene. They sure left in a hurry, Eric said. They did at that, Willis responded. But they didn't make this mess, and neither did an unfriendly black bear. They had visitors, human visitors. He led them over to the campfire. Take a look. Ashes and partially burned firewood were scattered over a large section of the area, as if someone had dealt it several hearty kicks. And look here. He pointed at the soft black earth. Boot tracks, Calvin said. Mr. Tulloch's? I don't think so. Over by the tent are some more tracks in a patch of sand. These look like Barbara Tulloch's, much smaller. And over here is a third set, smaller than the ones by the fire, probably her husband's. Willis led them back over to the beach. And finally we have a fourth set of prints here in the sand. They're much larger than anything the Tullochs would make, and a different tread. Confused. So we have 4 different sets of prints, Eric said. Maybe John Tulloch had more than one pair of boots. Good thought, Willis said. With that analytical mind of yours, you'd make a good Anishinaabe detective. Anishinaabe? Asked Eric. Anishinaabe, same as Ojibwa, actually means people, Willis said with a grin. He crouched down by the nearest set of tracks. Nah, these tracks don't all belong to John, although he may very well have brought along more than one pair of boots. The condition of the tracks tell us that they were all made at about the same time, although one set is a bit deeper. Meaning that one person was heavier than the other 3, Eric said. Calvin picked up several pieces of paper that were scattered around a small sumac bush. Observation notes made by the Tullochs, he said, glancing them over before stuffing them into his pocket. They look pretty technical. How old do you think the tracks are? Eric asked, studying the ones by the tent. Well, they probably were made after the light rain we had, night before last. Since then the weather's been dry. And there aren't all that many tracks, which likely means they were made sometime yesterday. Could the Tullochs have been taken somewhere? Eric asked. You know, kidnapped. Willis looked over at him and shrugged. Possibly, but I doubt it. More than likely they were just scared off. Whoever scared them off, or kidnapped them, did it sometime yesterday? Calvin asked quietly. Willis nodded. But why? Calvin asked. And why the mess? It looks like the intruders went through all the Tulloch stuff looking for something. We'd better report this to the police when we get back to Amish, Eric said. They might be able to track the Tullochs down and find out exactly what happened. Good idea, Willis said. In the meantime, let's clean this up and pack whatever we can into our canoe. Then we'll take another look at those rock paintings. Great, Eric said. I'll tackle this tent. Within 20 minutes, most of the scattered gear was stowed under a tarp in the middle of the canoe, and Willis and the boys were back out on the river. A dozen strokes brought them to the base of the steep granite cliffs, and Willis brought the canoe to a halt in the shadow of the tall rocks. Calvin rummaged through a duffel bag for his camera. The surface of the cliff was shadowed from the late morning sun, so he had to squint up at its dark grey surface. I can't see anything, Eric finally said. Calvin shook his head. There's just black marks up there. I think the paintings have been covered over. He took another look. Sure enough, someone had spray-painted the entire area, totally covering the ancient pictographs. Megauso's plan. Chief Pemujega poured a few of the gold coins from the leather pouch into his hand. "Gold," he muttered absently to Megauso. The two men were alone, sitting in the medicine man's tent several nights after recovering the gold coins from the beach. "How much would one be worth?" the chief asked. He picked up a coin and examined its inscription. "With one such coin, the Hudson Bay Company factor would be able to buy all of our winter furs and more," Megauso said simply. Lines of worry creased the old man's face. "You are wondering what we should do with such riches," Megauso said. "Rumors have already started that the Iroquois captured the treasure from the Americans during their recent war against the English," Chief Pemujega said. "And if that is true, now that there is peace between the two countries, will the Americans want the coins back?" "Perhaps. But why did the Iroquois bring the gold into our land in the first place? This makes no sense. Surely these coins were stolen months ago." Megauso rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "I think I know." He gazed into the fire. "The British own all of the Hudson Bay Company stores north of Lake Nipissing, and they have always been friends with the Iroquois. I think that the Iroquois wanted to buy guns with the coins they captured from the Americans. Did you notice that the Iroquois did not have many warriors on this trip? Perhaps it was because they needed space in their canoes for taking many rifles back to their villages. They may have been planning to buy these guns from the trading post on the Matagami or at Fort Thunderbird." The chief took a stick and poked at the fire before answering. "But why wouldn't the English sell guns to them at a place closer to their homes? Why would they come this far north just to buy so many guns?" "If the Iroquois were to use these coins to buy such a large number of guns from a trading post in the south, the Americans would probably learn of it. The gold belongs to the Americans after all, and the Iroquois are their enemies, as well as ours. For such a serious matter, the Americans might wish to resume their war against the British. But if the Iroquois came all the way up here to buy their guns from the Hudson Bay Company, they could keep things much quieter." "These coins would buy many, many guns," the chief said softly. "The Iroquois would surely have killed many of our people. The British and perhaps even the Americans will be looking for their gold," Megauso continued. "The moment we try to spend a single gold coin, the Hudson Bay Company factor will bring the redcoats in to make trouble. What can we do then? Throw these things away? Pretend we never found them?" He handed the medicine man one of the leather pouches filled with coins. "No." Megauso fingered the leather pouch. "Our people must no longer speak of this treasure. The coins will be hidden in such a way that they will disappear for many years, beyond the years of our lives and even the lifetimes of our children. One day they will be safe to use, long after the Americans and the redcoats have forgotten about them." The chief's eyes grew wide. "Yes, that is a good plan, Megauso. Even now our land is passing into the hands of the whites. Who knows what the fate of our people will be? This treasure may be just what the Anishinaabe need to survive in the years to come." For a time there was a silence between the two men. "It is a good plan, Megauso. But one thing, how will future generations know of these coins? Surely the secret will be discovered, or perhaps it will die before its time." Megauso looked calmly at the old chief. "It may be possible to solve this problem. The rock paintings we used to trap the Iroquois are new. No stories have yet been told of their origins. Tomorrow we will return to the cliffs and add clues to the paintings, clues that will tell our people about the coins and where they might be found." Megauso's gaze moved from the chief's fire to the entrance of the tepee and out into the distant forest. "The paintings will be there for future generations to see and ponder. To create confusion, we will also spread several different stories about the meaning of the paintings, but to one person in each generation will be entrusted the location of the treasure. I will see to it." The chief smiled. "Yes, And when the time is right, the treasure will be there for our people, perhaps at a time when it is needed most." He held up one of the coins and watched it glitter in the light of the fire. A smile eased over his wrinkled face. "It is a good plan. We will do this, for the sake of our children." Chapter 7. Visits and Visitors. The canoe trip back to the landing was even quieter than the ride to the camp. Willis and Eric seemed lost in their own thoughts. Calvin puzzled over what they had seen. Why would someone paint over these pictographs? He kept asking himself. At the landing, Calvin and Eric loaded everything into the back of the truck, while Willis scoured the small area for any signs of the professors or their visitors. Finally, he paused. "You know," he said, straightening up, "I don't think the two people who visited the Tullocks used this landing. Looks like only the professors have been here." "Could those guys have used another landing on the big Grassy to get to the Tullocks' camp?" Calvin asked. "Well, there are a couple of other jumping-off spots. In fact, there's one not too far from here, but it's a longer drive in from the highway, and the road's not as good." "Maybe they flew in," Calvin said. "Not likely. It would be almost impossible to land a plane on the Grassy." Eric tossed a sleeping bag into the back of Willis's truck. "Do you think it was Dr. Schmidt and his friend?" he asked. "Strong possibility, all right," Willis said. "Yet why would they spray paint the pictographs?" "That would certainly stop anyone else from studying them," Calvin said. They stood for a moment in silence. "We'd better get moving," said Willis finally. "We'll report the Tullocks' disappearance to the police in Amiche, then get over to Grandad's place in time for a late lunch." Despite the questions that hung in the back of Calvin's mind, the ride back to Amiche gave him an opportunity to take a closer look at the huge pine trees along their way. "This is what they call old-growth forest," Willis said when he noticed Calvin's interest. "Very old, and it's protected by the government from loggers." "It's really pretty, isn't it?" Calvin said. "You sure that the Tullocks weren't murdered or something?" Eric asked suddenly. "Not likely," Willis said. "The tracks at the last landing indicate that they left there alone. Apparently they separated from their mysterious guests back at the camp." Willis stopped at the general store in Amiche to phone the police about the Tullocks' disappearance. Then they made the short drive out of town to his grandfather's cabin. He was waiting for them in a dilapidated wicker rocking chair on his front porch. A pair of wire reading glasses was perched on his nose, and a worn black Bible rested on his lap. Two small children smiled shyly at the visitors and then scrambled across the yard to their own homes. Once again, Butch greeted them at the bottom of the steps, his long tail wagging a friendly welcome. "Thought the crows had got you, boys?" the old man said, getting slowly to his feet. "Did you deliver those college professors back to civilization safe and sound?" "They weren't there," Willis said matter-of-factly. "They weren't?" The old man's eyes grew wide. "Gone," Willis said. "It looks like they had a couple of visitors yesterday." "Yeah," Calvin said. "Made an awful mess of their camp. Willis thinks they were scared off." "Come on inside and tell me about it," Mr. Hamilton said. The three visitors followed him into the cabin and joined him at the kitchen table. The old man sat quietly, nodding his head and muttering to himself as Willis finished relating the morning's events. "Just as well you reported it to the police. Sounds mighty fishy." "Could the Tullocks have rigged this whole thing by themselves?" Eric asked. "Possibly, although college professors are usually reluctant to destroy pictographs that are centuries old." "Then it had to have been the visitors," Calvin said. "Well, you boys must be hungry. I was holding lunch for you." Mr. Hamilton rose from the kitchen table and moved toward the stove. "Got a little something warming here in the oven." When he opened the oven door, Calvin caught a whiff of baking bread. "Just another minute or so," Mr. Hamilton said. "You sure have a lot of books," Calvin said, walking over to the bookshelves lining the far side of the room. "You must like reading." Mr. Hamilton looked up from the gravy he was stirring in the pan. "That I do, Cal. I didn't learn to read until I was almost 40 years old, so you might say I've tried to make up for lost time." Calvin glanced at the titles and recognized classics by Dickens, Cooper, and Hardy, books on Native American history and culture, and many more on Christianity. "Okay, fellas." The old man carried the roasting pan over to the table. "Soup's on. Hope you don't mind eating your main meal so early in the afternoon." Calvin had never tasted a meal like it. Ruffed grouse with gravy, wild rice, homemade bread and jam. "This is absolutely the best," he said between mouthfuls. "Great food," agreed Eric. "I suppose it helps that you were almost starving when you got here," Mr. Hamilton said with a broad smile. Calvin sat back in his wooden chair and studied the old man's face. "I noticed that you've got a lot of books on Ojibwa history and stuff, but you've also got a lot of books about the Bible. I hope you don't mind me asking, but how come you find the Christian religion so interesting?" Mr. Hamilton looked up from buttering a large piece of bread, his eyes twinkling. "Well now, that is a good question. Sure you want to hear the answer?" Willis gave Calvin a warning glance. "He tends to get a little long-winded." "Poor Willis," said Mr. Hamilton. "He's heard all my stories at least 6 times. How would you boys like some tea before I start?" He poured them all a steaming cup of tea from his battered kettle, then leaned back in his chair. "When I was about 40 years old, I spent my winters trapping over by Gogama on the Matagami River. My trapping ground was real good back then, and the price of beaver was pretty good too. Willis's grandmother was still alive, and she kept me company during those long winter months in the bush. We only had one child, Willis's dad, and he was already grown up and out on his own. One February morning I was out checking my traps in a low, swampy area when I fell through the ice and got a good soaking. Well, my wife was waiting for me at the shack. It was 20 below zero with a stiff north wind, and I was drenched to the skin. No problem, I thought. I'll just make myself a good fire to dry out my clothes and take the chill off. But things went from bad to worse. I guess my hands were shaking like mad from the cold, and when I was chopping brush for the fire, the axe slipped, and I caught my leg a good one. Blood was everywhere. The old man paused to take a long sip of his tea as his small audience waited silently. Well, there was absolutely no way I could get around with my leg laid open like that. Every time I moved, it started to bleed like somebody'd turned on a tap, so I got a fire going with the brush I'd already cut, and I curled up, the most miserable-looking thing you'd ever see. You know, when I was lying there in the snow by the fire, I got to wondering, I'll bleed to death or freeze solid, and then what? What's going to happen to me after I die? I thought, God, I know I'm not ready to die. Please give me another chance. Well, I must have lain there for quite a spell, 'cause when my good wife finally tracked me down, the fire was long out, and I was unconscious. She got the fire going again and dried me out. Then she loaded me onto a toboggan and dragged me back to our cabin. When I took a turn for the worse, she packed me off to our village a few miles away. To make a long story short, I spent some time with the local school teacher and his wife. They nursed me back to health and taught me to read. They also taught me something even more important, that I was a sinner and needed God. As the old man paused for another sip of tea, Calvin glanced at the faces of his 2 friends. Both Eric and Willis were listening intently, their eyes following every movement Mr. Hamilton made. Those kind people showed me that verse in the Bible where it says, "For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord." I asked Jesus to forgive all my wickedness and to be my Saviour, and to come and live in me forever. And he did. The old man drained the rest of his tea and set the mug down with a note of finality. Calvin was trying to think of something to say when Butch began barking loudly out on the porch. Mr. Hamilton pushed back from the table. "Looks like we've got more company." Slowly he got to his feet. "Mr. Hamilton?" A tall man stood at the door, holding a notebook. "That's right, son. And who might you be?" The visitor extended his right hand. "Name's Kelly. I'm a reporter with the Toronto Tribune. Can I come in and talk to you for a few minutes?" Mr. Hamilton swung the door open. "Sure, we're just finishing lunch. Have you had anything to eat?" The reporter stepped past Mr. Hamilton into the cabin. "Yes, thanks. I got something at the general store in town." "Well, grab a seat at the table. I'll pour you a cup of tea." The old man shuffled over to the stove, poured a large mug of the dark tea, and handed it to his latest guest. "Mr. Kelly, this is my grandson, Willis, and his two friends, Eric and Calvin." The reporter nodded. He took his first sip of the scalding liquid, grimaced, and put the mug down on the table. "I'll get right to the point, Mr. Hamilton. I was told by the local people that you are the most knowledgeable native person in these parts, and if I'm going to learn anything about what I want to know, I'd better speak with you." Willis's grandfather refilled his own tea mug. "Oh, I'm a fountain of knowledge, all right." Calvin smothered a grin, but the reporter seemed to take Mr. Hamilton's words seriously. "Well, I'm following up a story that our paper ran recently. Do you get the Tribune up here?" "Can't say that we do. Toronto is a long ways off. A couple of weeks ago we ran a story about a gentleman who was originally from these parts. He had been down on his luck for a while, ended up in a Salvation Army hostel in Toronto. Anyway, before this old man died, he told the local chaplain a strange story about some rock paintings in this area. The chaplain told a friend who spoke to a Tribune reporter who wrote the piece on it." Calvin sat up straighter in his chair. Eric was leaning forward too. "What was this Ojibwa fella's name?" Mr. Hamilton asked. "Henry Champion." "Oh." The old man's eyes dropped back down to his mug of tea. "So old Henry died, did he? Knew he was having problems. But he was a good man." "Do you have a copy of the story with you?" Eric asked. "No, but I can tell you what the old man said." The reporter paused while he attempted another sip of his tea. "In a nutshell, Mr. Champion claimed to have been entrusted with the location of a treasure, buried somewhere in these parts. Imagine that. According to him, a long time ago, your people captured some gold from the Iroquois in a battle near here. Now this old guy wouldn't tell the chaplain where the treasure was located, but he did say that if some rock paintings on the Grassy River were decoded properly, it would lead to the treasure. And one other thing. Just before he died, Mr. Champion mentioned a name." The reporter glanced down at his notepad. "The chaplain said it sounded like Miss Annie. Ever hear of her?" Mr. Hamilton shook his head. "No, no one around here by that name." He fell silent, and Calvin waited, hoping he would say more. Finally, the old man shifted in his chair. "Well, to tell you the honest truth, I've heard whisperings of a treasure for years, but I thought it was all nonsense. Now it's beginning to make a bit of sense." "Didn't the Tullocks say they'd read about the rock paintings in a newspaper article?" Eric asked. "Yes, and now we know why Schmidt and his buddy are so interested in them too," Calvin said. "And no telling who else," Willis said, frowning. The reporter nodded. "Well, I thought the story would stir up some interest. I'm surprised you didn't hear about it." "I think your story stirred up more than just a little interest, Mr. Kelly," Willis said. "I'm afraid you've stirred up a real hornet's nest." Chapter 8. Unraveling. As Calvin and Eric trudged down the road into Amish, Eric glanced at the list of supplies the old man had given them. "Good thing the store stays open until 6, he said. I think our reporter friend was more than a little disappointed that Mr. Hamilton couldn't shed some light on those rock paintings, Calvin said. Or he just didn't choose to. Could be, said Calvin. Remember last week when we were here, Mr. Hamilton told us that he'd fill us in on those rock paintings some other time. Maybe this weekend is the time. A small bell above the door dinged as they entered the general store, and a stout, balding man in a white apron greeted them from behind the counter. "Howdy, fellas." "Evening," said Calvin. "We're just here for a few things." "Go ahead," the storekeeper said. "Give a shout if you don't see what you want." Calvin scooped up a wire hand basket and joined his cousin among the rows of tall shelves. White sugar, canned milk, oatmeal. Eric read quietly, and Calvin began looking for the sugar. At the far side of the store, the bell over the main door gave another loud ding. 2 pairs of heavy boots clomped across the floor and up to the counter. "Hello, my good man. I wonder if you can help us." Calvin elbowed Eric. "Dr. Schmidt," he whispered. He and his cousin retreated behind the baking supplies. "I wonder if you could help 2 lost strangers," the voice continued. "We're looking for a gentleman who lives around here, an Edward Hamilton. Could you tell us where we might find him?" There was a pause, then the storekeeper said, "Well, ain't that strange? This is the 2nd time today someone has been in here looking for that old man." "Oh," Dr. Schmidt's voice broke in. "And who else was looking for our friend?" "A reporter from the Toronto Tribune." The other man snorted. "Isn't that a coincidence?" Calvin wondered if it was the same guy he had seen with Dr. Schmidt on the Blanche River. "I sure can tell you where our oldest citizen lives," the store owner continued with a laugh. "I hope you have better luck with him than the last fellow, though. That guy from the newspaper dropped back in here after visiting the old man. I guess Ed wouldn't tell him anything about what he was after." The storekeeper stopped to chuckle. "Ed Hamilton is pretty closed-mouthed, except when it comes to preaching. Then watch out." Someone shuffled his feet, and after a minute the storekeeper continued. "Anyway, to get to Hamilton's place you just keep going west to the edge of town, then take the first dirt road on your left. His cabin is a stone's throw down that road. You can't miss it. First one on your right." "Can we take our truck all the way to his cabin?" "Oh, sure, it's not a bad trail." "Thanks very much for your trouble. It's appreciated." The 2 men clumped out the front door. Calvin set the wire basket down on the floor, then poked his head out from behind the shelves. He scanned the back wall of the store. "Come on," he whispered. "There's a back door." The 2 boys scooted down the aisle and cautiously swung the door open. Calvin led the way down a narrow alley and around the side of the building facing the street. At the corner nearest the front of the store, he stopped and held up his hand. Boots shuffled down the wooden porch just around the corner. A match scratched roughly against the side of the building. The low voice of Schmidt's partner finally broke the silence. "What do we do?" His words were barely audible. "Pretty soon, half the country will be coming up here to check out those paintings and talk to that old man." "That's a distinct possibility, all right." "Maybe the old man doesn't know as much about the paintings as everyone thinks, and maybe that guy who started the story was crazy as a loon." There was another short pause. Calvin glanced at his cousin and pressed closer against the wall. "So what do we do?" That was Schmidt's partner again. "We grab the old man," Schmidt said in a low voice. "Make him talk." "Make him talk? I don't know about that. I don't know if we can force an old codger like that to talk. Some of these Ojibwa guys are pretty tough. Besides, if we lean on him too hard, it could be too much for the old guy." "You forget, I'm a doctor." Schmidt chuckled softly. "Even the toughest men find it hard to keep quiet when they get a dose of sodium amytal, truth serum. We'll have that old bird chirping like a canary before he knows what hit him." The laughter of the two men faded down the wooden sidewalk. "They're heading out to get Mr. Hamilton," Eric whispered. "What are we going to do? We'll never beat them back there. They've got a truck." "We've got to talk to the police," Calvin said. "Come on, we'll call them from the store." They sprinted back down the alley to the store's rear exit and pushed the door open. "There you are," the store manager said in his loud, friendly voice. "I wondered where you'd gone off to." "Can we use your phone?" Calvin asked. "It's an emergency." "Help yourselves, as long as it's not long distance." He pulled an old black phone from under the counter and set it before the boys. "What's the number for the police?" Calvin asked. The storekeeper flipped the phone book open and pointed to a number written there. "Closest cops are in Gauganda," he said. "The same ones Mr. Hamilton's grandson called this afternoon. It usually takes them about a half hour to get here." "Half an hour?" Eric groaned. Calvin dialed quickly, and the eyes of the store owner grew larger as the situation was explained to the police dispatcher. He hung up the phone with a bang. "Let's get going. Maybe we won't be too late." He glanced at the storekeeper. "Can you direct the police to the Hamilton place?" The storekeeper nodded, his face sober now. Calvin and Eric went through the door and down the street at a dead run. Maybe Schmidt and his partner would stop somewhere on the way to the cabin, Calvin thought. And what about Willis? He glanced down at the dirt road under his feet, searching for fresh tire tracks. This is hopeless, he couldn't help thinking as they pounded down the road. But maybe God would protect Mr. Hamilton. "Help us, God," he prayed silently. At the last bend of the narrow trail, he heard the roar of a truck engine just ahead of them. Both boys dove into the bushes a split second before a large red and green truck barreled around the corner of the road and zoomed past them, going the other way. Eric glanced at his cousin. "Think they saw us?" "I doubt it. Come on." They sprinted the last few feet to the front door of Mr. Hamilton's cabin. Calvin dashed up the porch stairs and into the cabin. The darkness inside stopped him momentarily. The place was a mess. The kitchen table had been turned over, and dishes and utensils were scattered everywhere. Calvin squinted into the far corner. There, in a crumpled heap, lay Willis, a small pool of blood collecting by his head on the floor. "Willis!" He and Eric rushed across the room. Calvin turned his friend over and looked into his pale face. "Is he dead?" Eric asked. Chapter 9. It's going to blow. "I'll be okay. Honest." Willis rolled into a sitting position and swung his feet over the side of the cabin's only bed. He put a hand to his forehead. He looks so pale, Calvin thought. The policeman shook his head and opened a battered notebook. "Those are bad hombres," he said. "We got word the other day that Schmidt might be in the area, so we've been trying to keep an eye out." He inspected the welt on Willis's forehead. "That could have been really bad if it was a bit closer to your temple." He checked his notebook. "Now, you say that you think Schmidt and his partner are interested in the same rock paintings as the two professors from Toronto?" "We think that's the case," Willis answered. "Why would they take your grandfather?" Willis shrugged. "There was a reporter here from Toronto. I guess his paper ran a story recently claiming that there was a treasure of some kind buried in this area years ago. Schmidt must figure that the rock paintings hold the key to discovering where the treasure was buried. What about your grandfather, though?" Calvin took a step closer to his friend. "They must think Mr. Hamilton knows the secret behind the pictographs," he said. The policeman scribbled something in his notebook and turned his attention back to Willis. "Can you think of any place around here that they might have taken your grandfather? Abandoned cabin, hunting shack, a camp they may have set up somewhere?" "No," Willis said. "Could be a million places." "Okay." The policeman flipped his notebook shut. We'll start working on this right away. I'm putting in a request for a couple of extra officers. This is getting very serious. We'll do everything we can, and we'll be in touch." The policeman nodded to the boys and stepped outside. Calvin could see that darkness was quickly falling. "Good grief, that's smarts," Willis muttered as he struggled slowly to his feet. He placed a hand gingerly on his forehead. "It stopped bleeding," he said. "I'll be fine. Just give me a few minutes." He sat down again on the bed and drew several deep breaths. "What are we going to do?" Calvin asked. "We can't just sit here. I don't think that cop has a hope of finding your grandfather." Willis straightened himself and looked over at the boys. "Did you say that Schmidt and his friend are going to get the old man to tell them about the rock paintings by injecting him with truth serum?" Calvin nodded. "What then?" Willis asked. "I can't see them just letting him go after all that." He rose to his feet. "Come on, we're wasting time." Slowly he moved across to the door, picking up his leather jacket on the way. "Just a sec." He stopped at the door and glanced back at his two friends. "I feel a bit like a hypocrite, but if there ever was a time to ask for God's help, it's now." Calvin felt a bit awkward, but he bowed his head and waited for Willis to begin. "Please help us, Lord, to find Grandad, and keep him safe, we pray. Amen." They followed Willis out into the cool night air. The evening had long since grown dark, but a full moon lit up the night sky. Willis gave a sharp whistle, and Butch emerged from under the porch. "Where were you when I needed you earlier this evening?" Willis asked, rubbing the dog's head. "It's going to be tough finding those guys in the dark," he said as he led the boys over to his old pickup. "But I doubt if they'd take Grandad too far. At least I hope they didn't." He stood by the truck, thinking out loud. Now, if they're the ones who scared the Tullocks off, they might just go back to the same landing they used before to get to the Grassy. "But how many landings are there for getting into the river?" Eric asked. "Only 2 or 3 that are close by." Willis pulled a large yellow flashlight from the truck and walked a little way down the dirt road, studying the ground. "These look like Schmidt's tire tracks," he said finally. "Pretty ordinary tread, but I should be able to pick it out again if I see it. Anyway, we'd better get going." He returned to the truck and released the tailgate. "Hop in, Butch. You might come in handy." The big dog leaped eagerly into the back of the truck. Calvin checked his watch as he followed Eric and Willis into the truck's cab. 10:15 p.m. He was starting to feel the fatigue of a long day as they pulled out of the settlement and bounced down the road into the darkness. What if they should actually catch up with the old man's kidnappers? Surely Schmidt and that partner of his would be armed. Just then, something over Willis's shoulder caught his attention. Cradled in a rack in the rear window of the pickup was a high-powered hunting rifle. Now that would make for a real equalizer. 5 miles west of town, Willis pulled off the main highway onto a narrow bush road that wove in and out of the trees like a long, dark snake. Willis stopped the truck and climbed out of the cab, studying the road in front of them with his powerful flashlight. "Bingo!" Willis said, climbing back in and shifting the truck into gear. "They came this way." Calvin's heart lurched. He looked sideways at his cousin, their eyes meeting briefly. "Where would they be camped along here, Willis?" Eric asked. "Well, there's only one really good spot, and that's down by the river, at the landing." "How far is that?" Eric asked. "About 20 minutes, just enough time to get our act together." They drove in silence for the next few minutes, and Calvin could tell from Willis's face that his mind was far away. "What we'll do is stop a piece back from the landing and walk in," Willis finally said. "But Schmidt will have had an hour or 2 to work on Grandad. They might even be finished." Finally, he pulled the truck into a small clearing and killed the engine. A minute later, they stood silently in the cool night air, while Willis released Butch from the back of the truck. All around them, the blackness was filled with the sounds of the forest. Calvin shivered. He pulled his nylon jacket closer around his shoulders as Willis eased the rifle from the window rack. Willis started down the darkened road at a quick trot with Butch close at his heels. The night air whistled in Calvin's ears as he jogged behind his friend. With each step, he expected to be brought face to face with Mr. Hamilton's kidnappers. A few minutes later, Willis slowed his gait and held up his hand. "The landing's just around the next bend," he whispered. "Do you hear anything?" Calvin held his breath, listening. The night sounds seemed to have intensified since they left the truck, probably because they were so close to the river, but nothing unusual caught his attention. Willis clicked off his flashlight. He hunched over and moved silently down the last part of the trail. Calvin, Eric, and Butch followed almost on his heels. A light ahead of them shone dimly through the trees. Shh! Willis crept behind a large bush at the edge of a clearing. The light came from a tent 100 feet away. Shadows moved about within it. On the other side of the camp, between the river and the tent, Calvin could see the faint outlines of a pickup truck and an ATV. A low murmur of voices came from the tent. Willis once again checked his rifle, then lowered himself onto his belly. "Stay," he whispered to Butch. Then he motioned a similar command to the two boys. With the rifle clutched in his right hand, he slithered across the ground, through the bushes toward the camp. A few feet from the tent, Willis pushed himself to his knees and waved them forward. Calvin and Eric dropped to their bellies and inched their way through the underbrush. Butch trotted silently behind them. When they reached Willis, they lay still for a moment. "I'm going to the other side of the camp," Willis whispered. "I've got an idea. I want to be between them and their truck, in case they make a run for it." Quickly, he got to his feet, and keeping to a crouch, retraced his steps back to the trail. The voices within the tent were audible now. Calvin could catch words, then phrases. As he adjusted to the sounds, the conversation between the two men inside became clear. "Okay, that's that." It was Schmidt, his voice a low growl. "I told you this stuff would work. Never fails." "But what's he told us?" The frustration in the other man's voice came through clearly. "He don't know nothing." "Don't worry. We've got all the clues, all the information he can give us. We'll figure the rest out. In the meantime, what do we do with the old man? We can't just let him go back and tell everyone." Suddenly, from just beyond the tent, a yellow wall of flame shot skyward, lighting up the whole night. "What?" The two men rushed outside their tent. "The pickup's on fire." Sure enough, flames were already spreading from every part of the vehicle. "What happened?" Schmidt's partner shouted. "Look out! It's going to blow!" At that moment, a large shadow emerged silently from the brush just behind the two men. "So that's where he went," Eric whispered. Willis's rifle swung in an arc and crashed down on the pistol in Schmidt's right hand. The man gave a startled cry as the gun flew from his grasp. He wheeled in the darkness, just as the truck erupted in an explosion of flames. Chapter 10. Miss Annie. The blast from the exploding truck felt as if someone had opened the door to an enormous furnace. It blew the boys off their feet and showered the area with 1,000 particles of wood, steel, and burning embers. Calvin found himself on his knees, gasping for breath. The whole area had suddenly taken on a strange aura of unreality. Sparks and fires glittered in the blackness, casting eerie shadows everywhere. "Cal, are you okay?" "I think so," Calvin said. On the far side of the clearing, two shadows flitted through the darkness. Then an engine roared to life, accelerating to a crescendo as it screamed past them into the night. "The ATV!" Eric shouted. "Schmidt must have taken the ATV." "Willis! Where's Willis?" Calvin coughed and peered around the camping area. The tent had been partially blown down in the explosion. He stumbled over to where he had last seen Willis and the two men. "Willis!" Their friend lay on the ground, coughing violently. Calvin took charge. "Eric, you look after the tent. Mr. Hamilton's in there. Don't let it catch fire. I'll take care of Willis." He knelt beside his friend. "Willis, you okay? What on earth happened?" Slowly, Willis opened his eyes. "Ouch. Beats me. I found— Oh, never mind. I'll tell you later." He sat up slowly, then struggled to his feet. "Where's Grandad?" "Eric's looking after him." Calvin eyed his friend. "What's the matter?" "Where's Schmidt?" Willis asked. "Gone," Calvin said. "They left on the ATV. Looks like they took both guns too." "Let's check on Grandad," Willis said. "They'd better not have hurt him." He picked up the flashlight from the ground where he had dropped it. Eric had the tent propped back up and was kneeling next to Mr. Hamilton just inside the door. "His heart rate seems to be okay," Eric said, his hand on the old man's pulse. Willis squeezed past Eric and knelt by his grandfather's side while Calvin lit the Coleman lantern. "Grandad, wake up!" Willis slapped the old man's cheek gently, surveying his grandfather for signs of injury. Mr. Hamilton's eyelids fluttered briefly and then opened. "Will?" "Grandad, you gonna make it?" The old man stirred, coughing weakly. "Feel real foggy. Those fellas stuck a needle in me earlier." He coughed again. Willis found a couple of sleeping bags rolled into a corner of the tent. "Here, let's make him a little more comfortable." "What happened to those fellas who grabbed me?" Mr. Hamilton asked. "And what's that fire over there? It looks pretty big." Light from the burning truck shone through the thin wall of the tent. "Don't worry about it, Grandad. A little bonfire. We should have a wiener roast." Willis carefully moved the old man into a more comfortable position. "You warm enough?" "Oh, sure." The old man paused for a moment before continuing. "I guess they gave me something to make me talk about the paintings, eh?" He shifted his gaze. "I never expected anything like that. If they beat me, I was going to tell them all I knew. No fuss. But I don't remember much of what happened after they poked that needle in me." "How do you feel?" Calvin asked again. "Not so bad," the old man said. Then he grinned. He rubbed his eyes and blinked several times. "I was ready for whatever those fellas had in mind anyway." "How do you know what they had in mind?" Calvin asked, puzzled. "I didn't really," Mr. Hamilton said. "But I figured that the very worst they could do was kill me, right? And if I was ready for that, well, everything would be all right." Calvin stirred uneasily. The old man was studying him again. "You'll see, Cal," Mr. Hamilton said, the light from one of the small fires illuminating his face in the darkness. "Life is like a breath of summer wind. It passes by in an instant and is gone. But it doesn't vanish forever like some people think. It just moves on." Before Calvin could answer, Butch pushed his head into the entrance of the tent, panting loudly, his tongue dangling from his mouth. "So there you are," Willis said, pulling the dog in next to him and rumpling his fur. "Now here's someone who disappears every time there's the least bit of trouble." Mr. Hamilton laughed and drew himself into a sitting position, stroking the big dog's head. "You got a plan, Will?" he asked. "With the little bit I was able to tell them, those fellas might be able to put everything together." "What exactly did they ask you?" Eric asked. "I could really use some coffee," Mr. Hamilton said. "We've got to do some clear thinking between now and morning. How about you boys get a fire going and put a pot of coffee on to boil? There must be some around here." Calvin wondered if Mr. Hamilton had a reason for ignoring Eric's question. We'll get a fire going, if you promise not to talk about anything too interesting until we get back," he said. In a few minutes a kettle of water was boiling over a roaring fire. "Just pour the water into the pitcher with the coffee grounds," Willis said. "We'll drink it after the grounds have settled. Nothing fancy." Soon they were all sitting around the campfire, sipping at the bitter coffee. Willis's grandfather was propped against the trunk of a spruce tree, a sleeping bag pulled up around him. "I'm starting to feel better already," he said. "You figure Schmidt won't be back tonight?" Eric asked. "I don't think so," the old man answered. "They'll be busy trying to piece together where that treasure might be." "What happened with the truck, Will?" Eric asked. "Did you mean for it to explode like that?" Calvin could see the red creeping into Willis's face. "Not exactly," he said with a sickly grin. "It was an old truck, all rusted out and full of holes. I set fire to some of their gear in the back as a distraction. Dumb idea, I guess. The fire must have gone through one of the rust holes and set fire to a gas line or something. It surprised me as much as anyone." Calvin and Eric chuckled quietly at their friend's embarrassment. "What exactly did you tell them, Mr. Hamilton? Do you remember?" Calvin finally asked. "That's the thing," the old man sighed. "When they found out I didn't know where the treasure was, they asked about where the native people used to camp, where the trading posts used to be. They took a lot of notes. I don't know how helpful I was, but Schmidt and his buddy must know quite a bit by now, and they just might be able to put everything all together." "But where could the treasure be?" Calvin asked. "And how do we find it before Schmidt does?" "We'll just have to put the pieces together ourselves," the old man said. "The four of us might be able to come up with something." "But you've had all this time and you never found anything," Calvin said. "Don't forget I've heard stories about a supposed treasure for years, but I never knew it was still around until yesterday, same as you," said Mr. Hamilton. "The secret of the paintings was passed down to old Henry, not me." "Eric, do you have your description of the paintings with you?" Willis asked. "Sure." Eric dug into his pocket for his notebook. He leaned closer to the flames and peered at the description he'd written down a few days earlier. In a nutshell, there were 8 figures, 4 people, 1 with a spear, a canoe, a sun, a bird with an X-shaped figure over it, and something like a tornado or a whirlpool. "But what could it mean?" Calvin wondered out loud. "Are they supposed to be clues to finding the treasure?" "It's possible that only some of the pictures are clues," Mr. Hamilton suggested. "You know," Eric said, "that book about rock paintings has quite a few pictures in it of bird pictographs. Some of them look like the bird on the Grassy. They're called Thunderbirds. Do you suppose it's a Thunderbird?" "The Thunderbird is an important part of our folklore," Mr. Hamilton said. "Schmidt was asking me about that too." "What's the X doing over the bird's head?" Calvin asked. "I thought it was a lightning bolt when I first saw it," Eric said. "Or it could be X marks the spot," Willis said. "How can you bury a treasure inside a bird?" Eric asked, frustration edging into his voice. "Maybe we're supposed to be looking for a picture of a Thunderbird," Calvin said. Each of them considered the problem. "Are there any lakes or rivers around here that are named after a Thunderbird or something else in the pictograph?" Calvin asked. "Maybe they're referring to a place name." Willis and his grandfather looked at each other. "Of course," Mr. Hamilton said. "Lake Mzansi. It's Ojibwa for Thunderbird. That's not too far from here, in fact." "Mzansi," Eric echoed. "That sounds like the name old Henry mentioned before he died. What was it again?" "Miss Annie," Calvin said. "Miss Annie. That does sound quite a bit like Mzansi, doesn't it? I'll bet he was saying Mzansi, Thunderbird." "What's on the lake?" Calvin asked. "Any buildings?" "Nothing there now," the old man said thoughtfully. "Not even any cottages." "Was there ever anything there?" Eric asked. The old man's eyes grew large and he turned his head toward the boys. Of course. Now why didn't I think of it sooner? He nodded to himself. There's not much left of it anymore, but many years ago there was an old Hudson Bay post on Lake Mazanzi. Calvin's mind was racing. He glanced quickly over to Willis. What was it called? He asked. Fort Thunderbird, the old man said in a low voice. Willis took another sip of the grainy coffee. If you feel up to it, Grandad, we're going to get you home, grab a bit of sleep, and then be on our way. I think we just found out where we're going next. Chapter 11. Decision Postponed. Somewhere in the back of Calvin's mind, he could hear the faint stirrings of early morning. Slowly he rolled onto his back and pulled the sleeping bag down from his face. Floor's pretty hard, eh? Willis said in a low voice from over by the wood stove. Coffee's almost ready. Calvin ran his hands down his face in another attempt to wake up. I was so tired when we got here last night. I think I could have slept on a bed of nails. He heard Eric stir from his place on the floor a few feet away. How's your granddad? Calvin whispered to Willis. Oh, he seems to have survived the ordeal. He's still sleeping. Calvin struggled out of his sleeping bag and walked over to the large sink. You can wash up there, Willis said. You know where the bathroom is out back? Calvin winced as he slapped the cold water onto his face. Mr. Hamilton stirred in the room's only bed, still looking very peaceful under a large pile of blankets. When they'd arrived back at the village late last night, they had telephoned the police from a neighbour's. You blew up his truck, the policeman had shouted. When you found out where they were camped, you should have notified us right away. You could have been killed. It was an accident, Willis had explained, and Schmidt was about to leave. Look, I don't want you guys to take things into your own hands like that again. If something comes up, you let us know. In the meantime, we'll check out what's left of that truck and step up our search for Schmidt and his friend. Willis dropped a couple of eggs into the frying pan. Looks like more rain is on the way. Eric threw back his sleeping bag and staggered over to the kitchen table. Morning, sleepyhead, Calvin said in a loud whisper. That floor's hard, Eric said. Oh, you couldn't have been very tired if you noticed how hard the floor was, Willis teased. We'll have to work you harder today. What are your plans? Calvin asked. When do we leave for Fort Thunderbird? Soon as we can, Willis said. Oops, looks like Sleeping Beauty is waking up. Eric and Calvin turned in time to see Mr. Hamilton swing his legs over the edge of the bed and get to his feet. Gonna let me sleep all day, were you? He said. How are you feeling this morning, Grandad? Willis asked. Fit as a fiddle. Not that I'd ever have any trouble keeping up with you greenhorns. He shuffled over to the stove. Move aside and let a pro take over. Good to see you feeling better this morning, Mr. Hamilton, Eric said. You do look a little pale, though, Willis added. The old man hesitated over the frying pan. Pale, maybe, but no pale face. Calvin had to laugh at that, and Eric joined in. What's planned for today, Will? Asked his grandfather. Well, first we need to decide whether or not to take a look at old Fort Thunderbird. Maybe we should just forget all about rock paintings and secret messages. Forget about it? Calvin said, moving over to the kitchen table. We can't forget about it now. What if the treasure is over at the fort? We've got to take a look. Looking isn't finding, Willis reminded them. That old fort is a pretty big place. What's left of it? And the goods may not even be there. What do you think, Eric? I think we've got to at least try. We seem so close. Well, you can count this old man out, Mr. Hamilton said. That's about a 2-hour walk from the nearest road. Are you fellas up to that? 2 hours, Calvin exclaimed. It is quite a jaunt, Willis said. I've done some fishing on Lake Mazanzi and the trail is a bit rough. Can't we go by canoe? Eric asked. No, there's no direct route there by canoe, not from here. What if we used ATVs? Eric suggested. That would speed things up. Willis looked up from the table. Great idea, and it would make us a little more mobile should we meet up with Schmidt. Do you think he'll be heading for Fort Thunderbird? Calvin asked. That's a large possibility. Schmidt may be a sleazy crook, but he's no fool, Willis said. If we go to the fort today, it will probably mean we won't make it back home until late tomorrow, Eric said. We'd better see if that's all right with your mom. Too bad I didn't bring my ATV, Eric said. That would have been perfect. Well, I've got my old one, Mr. Hamilton said, but all three of you sure wouldn't fit on it. I've got an idea, Willis said. My cousin, Charlie Marsh, lives back near your lodge, Eric, and he owes me a rather large favour. I could call him from the general store and see if he'll put your ATV and my dirt bike on the back of his truck and drive them over here this morning. At the same time, you can give your mum a call and see if it's all right for you and Cal to stay over for another day or so. Okay, Calvin and Eric said in unison. Perfect. Sounds like a good plan, Mr. Hamilton agreed. If you can get hold of Charlie now, he could be here before noon, and you'd still be here for our little church service this morning. Church? Calvin said. You have a church here? Not only have it, I preach at it. This is Sunday, after all. The old man brought a large pot of steaming oatmeal to the table and a platter of fried eggs. You preach? Calvin asked. It figures a talker like him would enjoy preaching, eh? Willis said with a laugh. Couldn't miss having a captive audience like that. Actually, he can be pretty interesting. I've heard him a few times. But you haven't heard me preach for a while, the old man said, a twinkle in his dark eyes. Let's finish our breakfast. Then you can get into town and make your calls. Church is at 10, so we'll have to get a move on. The calls were made, and both Eric's mother and Charlie agreed to Willis's plans. Soon it was time for the service. Calvin had expected the meeting to be held in a small chapel in Amich, but instead Mr. Hamilton led them to a house a few doors away. Mr. Hamilton and his guests were greeted quietly by a plump, middle-aged woman. It was a larger home than Ed Hamilton's, but the living room was already crowded with about 24 people, most of whom were native. Calvin sat down with Willis and Eric on the floor with several of the younger people. Mr. Hamilton took a wooden chair across from them. Their hostess handed out small red hymn books, and then she led the singing. Calvin's Sunday school days came back to him as one hymn rolled into another. Words to the more familiar choruses returned as the enthusiastic singing warmed his heart and enlivened the small gathering. Finally, Mr. Hamilton put the little red hymn book down on the floor and opened his Bible. His audience leaned forward as the old man cleared his throat. When I was a young boy, my parents took me on a hunting trip. It was late autumn, and my father had just purchased a new rifle, a 7mm Mauser. This hunting trip was very important. My parents knew they had to get a moose to keep our family going during the long winter months. There was no government help back then, remember? If you went hungry, too bad. My dad hunted for about 3 weeks out behind Waboose Lake and hardly saw a single animal marking, never mind any moose tracks. It was a very bad fall, and my dad was beginning to get desperate. We knew that the really cold weather would soon come, and things would get even worse. Calvin gazed around the room at the rapt expressions on the faces of the listeners. One night, my dad and I stood out in front of our tent looking up at the sky. It was a cloudless night, clear and cold, just like it gets before the snow comes, and I knew he was very discouraged. I was watching him, there in the moonlight, when all of a sudden we saw this enormous comet flash across the sky. It streaked overhead as bright as anything and practically took our breath away. "It's a sign," my father said. "A sign that we're going to get something tomorrow. You see, my parents believed in signs, in omens. They were superstitious because I guess they felt defenseless and alone, at the mercy of whatever cruelty life threw their way. Even then, the signs my father recognized seemed to tell me that there was someone looking out for us. Well, as it turned out, we did get a moose before winter. Not the next day, but soon after we saw that great comet flash across the sky. And you know, for a good part of my life, I too looked for signs from the heavens that there was someone out there watching over me, caring for me. For many years I believed this, without knowing how such a thing could be true. Then one day I too received a sign, something better than a comet in the night sky. It was God, Himself, speaking to me through His own word. His word tells us that our Creator does care for us and has made a way for us to know Him. The old man opened his Bible to a page near the beginning, but when he began reading, to Calvin's surprise, he switched to the Ojibwa language. After several minutes, Mr. Hamilton switched back to English. People today still look for signs, don't they? There are times in all of our lives when we look to find out if there is a God and whether or not He loves us. Well, you don't have to look any further than this book here, for God's word tells us about His love, and it tells us that we need a Savior. God loved us so much that He sent His only Son to die for us and take away our sins. As the old man continued, Calvin found himself leaning forward like those around him. The many signs God has given to His people are His way of showing Himself to us. Is God speaking to you today? As the old man switched back to his native tongue, Calvin turned the words over in his mind. Signs of God's love. Did he need a Savior? He'd never thought about that before. The abrupt sound of a vehicle pulling into the yard distracted him from Mr. Hamilton's message, and he turned to it with relief. Willis's cousin must have arrived with Eric's ATV. Chapter 12. Fort Thunderbird. Charlie Marsh was a wiry man with a short, scruffy beard like Abraham Lincoln's. He was leaning against the cab of his truck, rolling a cigarette, when Willis and the boys joined him. "Good sermon, Will?" he said with a laugh. Willis ignored him and walked around to the back of the truck. The ATV and dirt bike were tied firmly in place. "Thanks, cousin," Willis said, running a hand over the fender of the red dirt bike. "Weren't nothing," Charlie said, eyeing Calvin and Eric. "I've been wanting to get over here and see a few of the folk anyway." Mr. Hamilton and the people who had been at the church service joined them beside the truck. "So you made it, Charlie," Mr. Hamilton said, extending his hand. "Did Willis introduce you to our two friends, Calvin and Eric?" Charlie nodded his head in the boy's direction. Then he pointed a thumb at the back of the truck. "Well, let's get 'em unloaded. I ain't got all day." Willis climbed up onto the truck and began to undo the ropes. "How come you needed these things in such a rush?" Charlie asked. "Fishing trip?" "No, we're going over to old Fort Thunderbird to take a look around. Haven't been back there for years." Charlie helped lift the dirt bike down from the truck. "What's so interesting over at the old fort?" Willis hesitated, untying the last rope that held Eric's ATV. "Probably nothing." He turned to his grandfather. "How long has it been since you've been to Fort Thunderbird?" "Quite a few years," Mr. Hamilton said. "Not much there for an old prospector to look at. It's pretty overgrown now, hardly any buildings left standing. Hasn't been lived in for 50 years, I guess." Calvin and Eric jumped up onto the back of the truck to help Willis with the ATV. As soon as it was on the ground, Eric checked the gleaming red machine, and children from the settlement gathered round to admire it. "Well, fellas," Charlie said, "I'll be seeing you later. Gotta wet my whistle before heading back." Mr. Hamilton frowned at the remark, watching the small crowd disperse to their various homes. "Too much time on their hands," he said with a shake of his head. Would get anybody into trouble. We need work. We need jobs to keep us busy. Get back our dignity." "Why don't the people just move?" Calvin asked. "This is our home," the old man said. "We've lived in this area for generations. Who would want to move to the city and leave all this?" He swept his hand in a descriptive arc at the surrounding trees. "Too bad there isn't some kind of an industry here, something for the people to work at," Calvin said. "Well, Grandad," Willis interrupted, "are you sure you don't feel like coming with us?" "Not today, thanks," he said. "When do you think you'll be back?" "Probably late tonight or early tomorrow. Hard to say. Who knows how long it will take to check out that old fort? We could spend a month of Sundays without finding a blooming thing." "Well, if you're not back by noon tomorrow, I'll fire up the old ATV and come looking for you." The old man grasped Willis by the arm. "Look, Will, I feel responsible for you and these two boys here. I want you to promise me one thing. If Schmidt's there, you'll steer a wide berth around him." Willis patted his grandfather on the shoulder. "Don't worry, old-timer. Schmidt won't even know we're there. You know how quiet us Indians can be." He glanced up at the sun. "It's almost noon. Let's get packed up and don't let me forget that metal detector of yours. It might come in handy." They ate a quick lunch, and then, with their gear packed on the back of Willis's dirt bike and Eric's ATV, they sped down the trail that would take them to Fort Thunderbird. The trail to the fort wasn't as bad as Calvin had feared. Some places even allowed the drivers to open up their machines to at least half throttle as they maneuvered their way through the forest. "We'll be there sooner than I expected," Willis yelled back at them. After almost an hour of pounding and bouncing on the back of the ATV, Calvin felt like he'd been riding a bucking bronco for a week. Everything around them was looking the same now, and the open stretches were a welcome relief. They could make better time. The trip reminded Calvin of their first expedition down the Grassy River. He had the familiar feeling of wondering if they'd ever reach their destination. What would his parents think if they could see him right now? If they knew what he'd gotten himself into? He sighed as he remembered what awaited him back home at the end of the summer. A home without one of his parents. A couple of times Willis stopped so they could all stretch their legs and work the kinks out of their backs. Finally, on one of the stops, he switched off his dirt bike and waved for Eric to do the same. He then pushed his bike off the trail until it was hidden behind a bushy spruce tree. "What's going on?" Calvin asked, as he helped Eric roll his ATV in behind Willis's bike. "The fort's just up ahead," Willis explained. "We'd better walk the last bit in case we're not the first ones there. No sense in advertising our arrival." Calvin and Eric nodded. Willis untied the metal detector from the side of Eric's ATV. Calvin thought the long metal object looked like a weed whacker with the controls up near the top. He picked up one of the two duffel bags they'd brought and followed Willis and Eric the last half-mile or so to the remains of the old fort. "Looks like we're the first ones here," Willis said in a low voice. Through an opening in the trees ahead of them, Calvin caught sight of a large clearing. Beyond it sparkled the blue waters of Lake Mazanzi. Only the birds and squirrels disturbed the silence of the warm afternoon air. "Looks like there's just one building left standing." Eric pointed to a faded two-storied frame structure that dominated the clearing. "That was the Hudson Bay Company trading post," Willis said. "The factor's house was just behind it, but they dismantled it years ago." "What's a factor?" Calvin asked. "The Hudson Bay Company manager," Willis said. "Well, it does look like we beat Schmidt here," Eric said. "If he's coming at all." "Yeah," said Calvin. "Maybe he knows something we don't." "He could be spending those gold coins already for all we know," Willis said. "We'd better get to it. This is going to take a while." He led the way down the hillside into a large field by the lake. There wasn't much to show for the fact that there had once been a small settlement standing on this very spot, Calvin thought. Other than the one house, only 2 or 3 broken-down sheds were left. The area was still free of trees, although grass and bushes grew up past their knees in most places. By the shore of the lake stood a 2-story house, grey and weather-beaten, its windows long since broken. Willis pulled a large sheet of paper from his back pocket and spread it out before them. "A map!" Calvin exclaimed. "Yeah, I got Grandad to draw what he thought the fort looked like 50 years ago. Someone was living in the factor's house till about then." All 3 of them knelt by the map. "Here's the lake," Willis said, pointing to the body of water dominating the north end of the map. "There's the old post and factor's house," he said, pointing to the 2 most prominent buildings on the map. "And here, scattered around the settlement, were the houses and sheds and stuff." "What happened to the people who lived here?" Eric asked. "Oh, they're long gone," Willis said. "But their grandchildren live all over these parts. Shining Tree, Gogama, Matagami." Willis looked back down at the map. "The house with the star on it belonged to my great-grandparents at one time. They lived here for a while, long before I was born." Calvin looked around, trying to figure out where the house should have been. "What happened to their house?" he asked. "My father dismantled it years ago to use for a trapping shack back in the bush." "So where do we start?" Eric asked. "Let's try to think of it from the point of view of those who were hiding the treasure," Willis said. "If we were them and were going to hide something in a small settlement like this, what would be some possibilities?" They surveyed the map again, glancing up at their surroundings from time to time for inspiration. "The trading post or the factor's house?" Eric asked. "Possibly," Willis agreed. "Let's start where the company house once stood." He looked up at the darkening sky. "And we'd better step on it. It looks like rain." They trudged across the rugged clearing to where the map showed that the factor's living quarters had been. Sure enough, the ground was strewn with old timbers and the remnants of a rock foundation. "This must have been it," Calvin said, surveying the ground around them. "But where would they hide sacks of coins around here?" "That's what we brought this contraption for," Willis said with a grin, and he held up the long metal detector. "But would they hide it in the settlement itself?" Calvin asked. "Or somewhere outside, in the bush, down by the shoreline, buried somewhere?" "Well, we're probably going to check out all those places before we're finished, including that big old trading post there." Willis pointed to the one structure that was still intact. "Imagine what this place must have been like 100 years ago," Calvin said. "All the activity. And now it looks so lonely and forgotten." "You should see it in autumn during moose season," Willis said. "Nothing looks as lonely as an empty building in the fall." He began to cross the ground, swinging the metal detector back and forth in front of him. "What if the treasure is buried several feet down?" Eric asked. "Your machine will never pick up the signals from something that deep." "You know," Willis said, "I don't think it will be that hard to find. After all, the treasure was buried by people who really wanted it to be found, so it's not likely to have been buried 15 feet down in the middle of nowhere." "Let's hope not," Eric said. "In the meantime, why don't you guys nose around the settlement? Check for anything that looks like a possibility. Take the map with you and try to figure out where all the houses once stood." For a while longer, Calvin and Eric watched Willis work with the detector. Then they began checking the clearing against the symbols on the map, searching for any familiar landmarks. But everything around them looked different from what Mr. Hamilton's map showed. Now there were only a few logs, part of a foundation, a tumbled-down shed or 2, and the one old building standing by the water's edge. "This is hopeless," Eric said. "We're never going to find that treasure. We don't even know if it's here, for crying out loud." Calvin nodded, trying to fight off discouragement. His cousin was probably right. Chapter 13. Clues. It was the knee-high grass in the clearing that made finding anything so difficult, Calvin decided. He trudged over to where his cousin stood. "How many buildings are marked on the map?" Eric unfolded the map again and laid it out before them. "Well, other than the old Hudson Bay Company post itself, there seems to be a total of 13 houses." Willis joined them, still swinging his metal detector back and forth at his feet. "Something else," he said. "People lived at this post for more than 100 years, from the early 1800s until about 40 years ago. The treasure probably dates back to when the post was just starting up. When the treasure was hidden, the village may have looked entirely different from this map. No telling what buildings were here then." "Why don't we check the old house, Willis?" Calvin suggested. "That'd be interesting." Willis glanced up at the sky. "We can if you like, but it looks like it'll be raining before the day's out. We'd better do all we can outside while it's dry, save the inside work for when it rains." Even as he spoke, lightning lit up the sky, and thunder rolled ominously in the distance. "Smart thinking," Calvin said. With the map in hand, Eric acted as the group's navigator, leading Willis and the metal detector slowly around the site. In most spots, there was little evidence to show that more than a dozen families had once lived in the small clearing by Lake Mzansi. Several times during the afternoon, the metal detector beeped shrilly, indicating that something metallic was buried beneath the soil. The treasure hunters unearthed a dozen nails, a rusted-out pail, a brass pot, and a couple of tin cans before finally pausing long enough to eat the sandwiches they had packed. When the sunlight began to fade, all they had to show for their work was a small collection of junk piled in the middle of the clearing. "At least the rain held off," Eric said. Willis sagged onto the ground by one of the sheds, rubbing his shoulders as the first drops of rain began to fall. "We can finish this off later," he said, getting to his feet. "Let's give this metal detector a rest while we check the house." He sprinted back across the clearing to the little knoll where they'd left the duffel bag, and soon caught up with Calvin and Eric. A tumbled-down porch still hung from the front of the old Hudson Bay Company post, its roof sagging badly over their heads. Willis led the way in through the open door and looked around. "Pretty gloomy," Calvin said. Willis pulled another package of sandwiches, a thermos, and a flashlight from his duffel bag. "Evening snack," he said, moving back toward the front door. "Let's eat on the porch. The air's a bit fresher." They picked a dry spot against the outside wall and sat down with their cheese sandwiches. Exhaustion swept over Calvin as he stared across the lake. The rain had picked up a bit and was falling steadily around them. "The treasure's got to be here in the house," Eric said. "We've looked just about everywhere else." "Hopefully," Willis agreed. "But like I said, no telling what the settlement looked like 150 years ago. We may have to check back beyond the edges of the clearing." "It's getting dark. What time is it?" Eric asked. Calvin glanced at his watch. 8:30. 8:30? Eric said. "I didn't think it was that late." "Looks like we're going to have to spend the night here," Willis said. "If we don't find anything in the house, we can check the grounds beyond the clearing tomorrow." "Well, we do have our sleeping bags and more food back at the bikes," Calvin said. "The folks aren't expecting us until later tomorrow anyway." Willis stuffed their empty wax paper back into the duffel bag and rose to his feet, stretching his arms as he gazed out over the lake in front of them. "Pretty spot," Calvin said. "I guess people have been admiring this view for hundreds of years." Willis grinned at his friend. "Yeah, too bad we can't pick up a postcard to send to your mum." He sighed. "Well, we'd better get at it. This house will take a while. I want to search it from top to bottom." He flipped on his flashlight, and the boys followed him through the front door. The main floor was simply one large open area with a steep staircase in the far corner leading to a second story. Calvin looked for furniture, but could not see a stick of it anywhere. Only the dusty floorboards, bare grey walls, and 3 broken windows. "So this was the old trading post?" Eric asked. "Boy, it sure is empty now," Calvin said. "No furniture, no rooms, no stove, nothing." Willis crisscrossed the room, checking the dirty floorboards carefully with his flashlight. Glass and bits of plaster and wood lay strewn everywhere, along with the dirt and decay of more than 50 years of neglect. "This place gives me the creeps," Eric said at last. "What are you looking for?" Calvin asked. "A trap door," Willis said. These old houses usually had a trap door leading to a root cellar. Could be the treasure was buried there. He paused and stood thinking for a moment. "Can't you find one?" Calvin asked. "I don't see any, but this floor's so dirty it might be right in front of my nose. It would probably be just as quick to crawl through a hole in the foundation outside, so I'll try that. In the meantime, you guys check this place over." Willis pulled a small pen light from his jacket pocket and handed it to Eric. "Look for any places in the walls or floorboards where something could be hidden." He picked up the metal detector and disappeared out the door. "Where do we start?" Eric asked. "Let's cover this room first." They began with the floorboards and walls of the big room, looking for anything that seemed unusual. From the crawl space beneath them they heard scraping sounds. "Willis must have found a way under," Calvin said. "Hope he's got room to move around with that metal detector." "There's got to be a loose board around here, a crack in the wall, something that's suspicious," Calvin mumbled, but the room looked disappointingly ordinary. Finally Eric said, "Let's check the top floor." The boys had to pick their way carefully up the rickety staircase to the second floor. As they arrived at the top of the stairs, Calvin said, "It looks like we don't have to worry about checking the attic." Sure enough, the rafters and roof boards were visible above them. In several places the rain was dripping through cracks and puddling the floor. Before them was another wide-open area with only a small window at each end of the large room. "Watch the floorboards," Calvin said. "They might be rotten. Could mean a fast trip downstairs." They picked their way carefully down one side of the room, guided by the small beam from their flashlight. Despite the sound of the rain on the roof, they could hear Willis scrounging around 2 floors below. "Could there be a secret panel in the floor or the wall?" Eric asked. "That's what I was wondering," Calvin said. "Let's keep a lookout for any cracks." Starting at one side of the large room, they began a painstaking search of every inch. 20 minutes later, Eric returned to the steps and sat down with a thud. "There's nothing up here," he said. "Let's wait until Willis is finished and he can check things more thoroughly with the metal detector." "You know, I'll bet that treasure has already been found." Calvin joined his cousin on the step. "Someone may have found it and spent it all without telling anyone." "Pleasant thought," Eric grunted, running a hand through his hair. From the room below them, Willis shouted, "Guys, come on down here for a minute. Take a look at this." Calvin and Eric bounded down the flight of stairs. Willis was standing with both hands planted firmly on his hips, rainwater dripping from his hair. His clothing was dirty from crawling around under the floor, but he was smiling broadly. Beside him was a metal box about the size of an old-fashioned bread box. "You found that under the floor?" Calvin asked. Willis picked up the box, keeping a careful hand on the bottom. It was made of tin and rusted almost through in several places. "What's in it?" Calvin asked. "Afraid it's not the treasure," Willis said, easing the lid back. Calvin and Eric peered inside. It was filled with papers and other documents. A pile of letters rested on the top. Willis picked up the handful of letters, and a couple of them crumbled at his touch. "I checked everywhere under the floor," he said. "No root cellar, nothing. This was the only thing I found, and it wasn't even buried. Just sitting there right smack dab in the driest part. There may be a trap door nearby. We'll check it out later. There might be some clues about the treasure inn with those letters and stuff, Eric said. It's a long shot, Willis said, but worth going through just in case. Suddenly, his face grew tense. He snapped the lid shut, switched off his flashlight, and handed the box to Eric. Then, he whipped off his bush jacket and pointed to the duffel bag by the door. Quick, grab the bag and the metal detector. Someone's coming. He began whisking his jacket back and forth across the floor. Calvin snatched up their gear and headed for the door. An engine muttered, coming closer every minute. It seemed to be almost on top of them. Willis! What are you doing? Getting rid of our tracks. Run for the bush, you two. Calvin and Eric sprinted toward the shadowy clump of trees, and Willis followed, swishing his jacket back and forth in the sand behind him. A light appeared at the far edge of the clearing as Willis dove in beside them, landing among the wet lower branches of a large jack pine. A headlight bounced its way through the drizzle toward the house. It's an ATV, Eric said. The vehicle pulled around the corner of the building and slid to a stop by the front porch a few feet from where the boys crouched. It held 2 people. The driver leaned forward and turned off the engine. Then he reached up and yanked off his helmet. Even in the growing darkness, Calvin knew immediately who it was. He groaned. Schmidt. Chapter 14. Midnight Shadows. They crouched in the wet pine branches, watching as Schmidt and his partner dismounted from their ATV. There's almost nothing here, Schmidt's partner said, shaking the water from his jacket. Sure this is the place? This is Fort Thunderbird, or what's left of it, Schmidt replied. That old Ojibwa woman from Gogama said one of the legends mentions a treasure buried in an old fort. That bird on the rock paintings must have been a thunderbird. Willis looked over at Calvin and Eric. I know, the other man said, but this isn't much of a fort. Anyway, I'm soaked to the skin. He shuddered. This place gives me the creeps. Let's get inside and dry out. Schmidt walked to the back of their vehicle and unstrapped a large canvas bag. A metal detector protruded from the edge of the canvas. I brought a change of clothes for us, Schmidt said. He pulled a large flashlight from the duffel bag, then mounted the steps of the building. Let's change, and then check out this place. The 2 men disappeared inside. Although the rain had slackened, the place where Willis and the boys crouched was soaking wet. Let's get out of here, Willis whispered. He started off through the trees to the trail that led away from the fort. What are we going to do? Eric asked. We haven't finished checking the place over yet. Willis paused on the trail. A small grin lit up his face in the growing darkness. Fellas, sitting back there in those wet bushes gave me an idea. But first, let's get back to our bikes and pick up the rest of our gear. I brought a little tent, so we'll find a place to set up camp. We can dry off and check out the stuff in the tin box, then I'll tell you my idea. Within a half hour, they had retrieved the tent and supplies from their bikes and had found a camping spot in a nearby grove of pine trees. Eric and Calvin scouted for dry wood while Willis set up the tent. Much to their relief, the rain had finally stopped. Wow, Eric exclaimed. This is nice, almost like a park. I've camped here during moose season, Willis said. Soon all their supplies were laid out before them, and they warmed themselves before a crackling fire. A kettle hung over the open flame. Willis dropped in a handful of coffee grounds. We're going to need to stay awake for a while, he said. Won't they see the smoke from our fire? Eric asked. Nah, they're not all that observant. Anyway, we're quite a ways from the fort. Willis pulled the tin box over to him and began looking through the documents. The boys dropped down as close to the fire as they could, trying to dry out their wet clothes. Anything useful? Eric asked. Probably not, Willis said. Mostly old letters and stuff written in the 1880s. A little late for what we're interested in, but we'll check them out more carefully later on. "Tell us your plan, Willis," Calvin said. Willis closed the tin box and looked up at the night sky. A large yellow moon was just drifting out from behind one of the clouds overhead. "Turned out to be a nice night, eh?" he said, the peculiar grin once again creasing his face. "What is it?" Calvin said, his voice rising. Willis eased back from the fire and squatted on his haunches, eyeing the two boys in front of him. "Fellas, I'd say this night would be the perfect night for a haunting. What do you think?" "A haunting?" Eric said. "What do you mean?" Calvin eyed him, waiting. Willis looked up into the night sky once again. "Notice the full moon above, and how that east wind is picking up. Did you see how jittery Schmidt's friend was? I doubt if it would take much to give that poor man a real fright." Eric grinned. "Great idea," Calvin said. "What if we could scare them right out of here?" "It's worth a try," Willis said. "Anyway, I've got a plan. You'll see how it works as we go along. But it could be dangerous. They have a gun this time, and we don't. We've got to be careful. In a couple of hours, they should be asleep. People who wake up suddenly from a sound sleep in the middle of the night generally aren't thinking straight." Calvin nodded in agreement. "Now I'm going to check this coffee out," Willis said, reaching for the kettle. "I'd like you guys to get a couple of hours' sleep. I'll wake you up." Calvin still felt chilly, so he ignored the shelter of the small tent and rolled up in his sleeping bag as close to the roaring fire as he dared. Eric did likewise. It seemed to Calvin that he had just closed his eyes when Willis was shaking him. It was still pitch black outside. He checked his watch by the light of the campfire, 12:30 a.m. "Rise and shine, sleepyhead." Calvin slipped out of his sleeping bag and pulled on his shoes, trying to think past the cobwebs in his head. A few feet away, Willis began playing with a length of thick nylon rope. "I brought this along in case one of the bikes got stuck," Willis explained. "It should come in handy tonight." A moment later, Calvin and Eric were following Willis's bobbing flashlight down the trail to the fort. The night air was warm, and for now the sky was free of clouds. Doubts about Willis's plan began to gnaw at Calvin. He remembered the gun Schmidt's partner had the last time they'd met, and he thought again of his parents back in the city. What would they think if they knew what he was up to at this moment? As Calvin followed his two friends into the clearing, the silhouette of the old house stood dark before them, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows across the landscape. "Quiet now," Willis whispered. "If things don't go as planned, we'll meet back at the bikes and get out of here fast." They crept through the grass and bushes toward the house. Only the noises of the forest disturbed the stillness. Just outside one of the broken windows, Willis motioned for silence, listening intently. Calvin thought he could hear heavy breathing from inside the house. "Okay, here we go." Willis checked the length of rope that was looped into his belt, then moved silently around the house to the front door. Calvin looked over at his cousin, wondering if Eric could hear the loud pounding of his heart. Taking a deep breath, he raised himself so that he could see over the windowsill into the house. Near the front door he could make out two large forms rolled up in their sleeping bags. He felt Eric ease up beside him and look into the room. A shadowy form moved silently across the floor toward the staircase. Calvin knew that one creaking floorboard under Willis's foot, one crushed piece of plaster or glass, would waken the two men. As this thought crossed his mind, he watched his friend disappear up the stairs. A few seconds later, Willis eased himself out the window above them, standing on the bottom sill with his head well above the roofline. With a quick movement, Willis pulled himself up and onto the roof. Calvin and Eric edged several feet back from the house and into the clearing for a better view. Willis fastened the rope around the brick chimney, gave it a couple of tugs, then let himself back down over the edge of the roof and into the upstairs window. Back at the window, Calvin peered inside, his eyes readjusting to the blackness. The floorboards creaked above them, then a low moan rose from the floor upstairs. He ducked as one of the dark figures on the floor stirred in his sleep. From the upper story, the creaking boards continued. Again the sleeper stirred, just as Willis gave another low moan. The man sat bolt upright. He gave his partner a quick shake. "Did you hear that?" Schmidt roused himself and sat up slowly. "What?" "Something's upstairs. I heard something upstairs." Schmidt's partner rose to his feet and flicked on a large flashlight. "Come on. Sounds like someone's up there." "Don't be ridiculous," Schmidt said. "Who could possibly be up there? Besides, we already checked the place over." Willis's silent form appeared at the window above the boys, and he pulled himself up onto the roof just as the footsteps sounded on the stairs. A moment later, Schmidt's partner returned. "I know I heard something." Sure. Get to sleep." "I don't care what you think," he said angrily. "This place gives me the creeps." The boys crouched by the window for several minutes more. Schmidt and his partner were just settling into their sleeping bags when Willis eased himself back into the upstairs window. More minutes passed, and the boys were beginning to wonder if Willis had fallen asleep when a floorboard creaked ever so slightly. "Listen," one of the men hissed. Silence. Calvin listened for the men's breathing. Nothing. Another faint creak. "Hear that?" the man whispered again. "It's an old house," Schmidt whispered back. "Bound to be some shifting—" I heard a groan. Silence. "I'm checking again." The flashlight flicked back on as he got up and crossed the floor to the stairs. Above them, Willis slipped from the window and pulled himself out onto the roof again. A moment later, Schmidt's partner came back down and clicked off the flashlight. Calvin eased his head up to the edge of the window. Instead of lying back down, the big man had returned to the corner of the room and was sitting with his back to the wall. "Go to sleep," Schmidt said in an angry voice. "There's nothing around here for miles, especially ghosts." His partner grunted and pulled the sleeping bag up around him. Willis held up one of his fingers as he slipped back inside the second-story window. It would be a while before anything else happened. The boys eased themselves down against the side of the building to wait. Calvin looked up into the night sky and watched the clouds drift across the face of the moon. He could feel himself getting sleepy, but Eric seemed alert. The words of old Mr. Hamilton ran through his head as he stared up at the full moon. "The wages of sin is death." Is that what he had said? "But the gift of God, now that would be Jesus, is eternal life." Calvin shook his head and held his watch up to the moonlight. They must have been here for over an hour. Finally, he risked poking his head over the windowsill. Schmidt's partner was quite visible now, slouched against the wall by the front door, his head lolling against his chest. Almost at once, Calvin heard a slight creak from the upstairs floorboards, followed by a soft moan. Schmidt's partner's head shot up, his left hand fumbling for the flashlight as he scrambled to his feet. "Did you hear that?" he said in a loud, hoarse whisper. Schmidt, too, struggled to his feet. "Yes, I heard something. Thought I was dreaming." The flashlight lit up the room as the men moved cautiously toward the staircase. Above them, Willis once again pulled himself out the window and onto the roof, just as the two men began to climb the stairs. Calvin tugged at Eric's elbow, then led the way across the clearing to a tumble-down shed. From there they could see Willis crouching beside the chimney and the two men moving about the top floor with their flashlight. "Now what?" Eric whispered. The light finally vanished from the upstairs window and reappeared a moment later on the main floor. Using the rope, Willis lowered himself all the way to the ground at the back of the house and joined them by the old shed. "How long do we wait?" Eric asked. "Till they're asleep," Willis answered. "It's getting cold," Calvin said, folding his arms in front of himself for warmth. "Glad I wore my jacket." The murmur of voices from the house continued for some time, and it was a good 20 minutes before someone turned off the flashlight. "They're ripe," Willis said. "We used to do this to moose hunters from the city when we were kids. Wonder we never got shot." He and the boys huddled back against the old shed. "Got to get them really groggy this time," Willis whispered. A great weariness crept over Calvin as the night wore on. His head bobbed against his chest, and his mind clouded. He jerked awake to find Willis nudging him. "Let's go." Willis moved across the clearing in his silent, crouched position, and Calvin and Eric followed. He left them by the same window and continued to the other side of the house. The forest was now completely still. Like the old expression, "the dead of night," Calvin thought. An owl hoot drifted toward them from the far side of the clearing. A pause. The hooting grew a little louder now and more persistent. The two men inside the house stirred in their sleeping bags. "Just an owl," one of them whispered. "Why don't it quit?" The monotone hooting became more and more insistent. Calvin and Eric watched as Schmidt and his partner pushed themselves out of their sleeping bags and crept to the window on the far side of the house. "I don't like this. I just don't like this," one of them whispered hoarsely as they reached the window. "You got your gun?" All at once Calvin heard the flashlight clatter to the floor and a shrill scream. "It's a ghost! I told you this place was haunted!" Schmidt's partner bolted for the door of the house. "Wait!" Schmidt said, going after him. "It can't be!" His partner was out the door and running before Schmidt had a chance to finish. Quickly, Schmidt retrieved the flashlight from the floor, grabbed the sleeping bags, and hurried into the night after his partner. From where they crouched at the far corner of the house, Calvin and Eric heard an ATV start up. They looked at each other in disbelief as the ATV accelerated across the clearing and disappeared into the forest. Calvin grinned. What on earth did Willis do that scared them so badly? Chapter 15. X marks the spot. Calvin and Eric raced to the other side of the old house, listening to the sounds of Schmidt's ATV disappear into the night. Willis stood in the middle of the clearing, chuckling to himself. A spiral of smoke drifted up from the grass behind him. "What happened?" Eric asked. "What did you do?" Willis just grinned at them. "A little light and smoke show," he said. "We'd better get back to our camp for a couple of hours of shut-eye. Those guys just might return." They trudged through the brush to where they had camped earlier and sagged down onto their bedrolls. Willis scratched together another fire, and the three of them hunched over the flames while Willis roasted some hot dogs. Calvin could feel his eyes growing heavier by the minute. "I'm turning in," he finally said, rising from the fire and spreading out his sleeping bag. "Guess we'd all better do that," Willis said. "Morning will be here before you can close your eyes." Despite his exhaustion, Calvin's eyes remained locked in a vacant stare at the trees above him, his mind turning the day's events over and over again. Mr. Hamilton's words came back to him as he gazed into the night sky, and he thought of the comet that had appeared as a sign to Mr. Hamilton's dad those many years ago. He looked over at his cousin. Eric's eyes were wide open too, staring into the fire. "Mr. Hamilton's message this morning was pretty interesting, eh?" Calvin whispered. Eric turned. "That stuff about the Almighty being a God of love is baloney," he said in a harsh whisper. "I don't believe it for a minute. Listen to what's on the news, for crying out loud. Would a God of love create such a mess?" Calvin rolled over to face his cousin. "Yeah, but he didn't create it like this. People made the mess you're talking about." Eric pulled the sleeping bag up under his chin and closed his eyes. Calvin closed his too, reluctantly. "Wake up, Cal." Eric was shaking his shoulder. It was morning. Calvin climbed out of his sleeping bag and shivered in the crisp morning air. A thin mist hovered above the ground around them. He slapped his arms against his sides for warmth. "Willis has gone back to the bikes to pick up a few things," Eric said. "It's cold. Should keep the bugs away for a while anyway." Willis strode back into the camp and dumped an armload of wood. "Morning, campers." He knelt by the remains of last night's fire. "Let's get breakfast going. Long day ahead of us, and we'll need our energy." He arranged dried sticks in a small circle and placed some birch bark among them. Carefully he set a match to it. "Eric, how about you rustle us up the ingredients for a mess of bannock? While he's doing that, Cal, you go through that old tin box we found at the fort. See if there's anything interesting." Calvin retrieved the box and returned to the fire, thumbing through its contents. "What am I supposed to be looking for?" "Anything that might help us. If that treasure isn't in the house, we've really got our work cut out for us, and I have a funny feeling it's not in the house." "So do I," Calvin said in a low voice, sitting down by the fire. He started easing through the contents of the container. The fire felt good, breaking the chill of the cold morning air. "Letter, letter, letter. This one has a date," he said. "Hard to read. They sure wrote fancy back then, June 18th, 1885. Wow, that was a while ago." "Not old enough," Willis said. "Got to be at least 50 years before that. Here's some papers. A few Hudson Bay Company invoices. No date." "Same handwriting?" Willis asked. "Looks like it." "What else?" "There's an old account book right at the bottom. Oh, here's a date. Starts January 1843. Looks like the factor of the post wrote up his accounts in this. The writing's different too, a lot smaller." "Good. That's getting closer to the time we're interested in. Take a careful look through the book." Calvin glanced up at his two friends. They were mixing flour and lard in a small frying pan. "The book seems to be a listing of the different trappers who brought furs into the post, including the date, the type of fur they brought, and what was paid. The notes are very detailed, although the ink is faded." He paged slowly through the book. "Doesn't seem to be anything unusual," he said, reaching the last entry. "Wait, here's a sketch of the village." "A map." Willis rose to his feet, and in 3 quick steps was leaning over Calvin's shoulder. Calvin turned the sketch so that his friend could see it, and Eric squeezed in beside them. "Look, there's the old trading post," Eric said, pointing to a large building on the map. "And the other houses are laid out around the post just like your granddad's map." "This is fascinating," Willis said. "Think of it. This map is well over 100 years old." His finger stopped at a house on the north edge of the clearing. "I don't remember seeing this house on Granddad's map." He peered closer at the drawing. "What's this on top of the building? A cross?" "Looks like one," Eric said. Willis glanced at them. A cross could mean a church or the priest's house. "Wasn't there a cross on the rock paintings?" Calvin asked slowly. Willis and Eric looked at him. "A cross?" Willis said. "Of course," Eric said. "The X over the Thunderbird. It wasn't an X. It was a cross." "Maybe they buried the treasure by the church," Calvin said, "or under it." "Let's go." "Whoa," Willis said, catching Calvin by the belt as he started toward the trail. "Eric's bannock is almost done. Let's grab a bite to eat first." A half-hour later, with his stomach full of bannock and tea, Calvin had a renewed sense of hope, and the morning took on a much brighter air. Even the trail back to the fort seemed more interesting, their task less hopeless. "Where do we look first?" Eric asked as he followed Willis down the path. Willis looked up at the sky. "It's going to be a clear day," he said. "When we get to the fort, we may as well start where the church once stood. If the treasure isn't there, we'll give the old house a good going over." "What if it's not in either place?" Calvin asked. Suddenly, Willis cocked his head to one side and held up his left hand. "Shh!" The boys froze where they stood. The faint sounds of an approaching engine drifted through the woods toward them. "Quick!" Willis leaped off the trail and down behind a large bush. Calvin crouched beside his friend in the leafy shelter and held his breath while the sound of the engine grew louder. "It must be Schmidt," Eric whispered. "He's coming back." An old yellow ATV bounced around the corner of the trail before them, slowing to take a sharp bend a few feet away. In that instant, Willis stepped from behind the bush and out onto the trail. "Hey!" he yelled at the top of his voice. The machine jerked to a stop, a few feet in front of Willis. Calvin could see the driver's startled expression even through the tinted visor of his helmet. "Where do you think you're going in such a hurry?" Willis said in his loud voice. The driver had both hands under the edges of his helmet as Willis approached the idling machine. With a swift upward shove, the helmet popped off his head and sailed through the air, landing in a bush several feet away. The driver gave his head of white hair several shakes. "Mr. Hamilton. Howdy, boys. I see that curiosity got the better of you," Willis said. "Just checking up on you, Will," the old man said with a grin. "I heard that Schmidt was in the area, and I got a little worried." "Good thing Schmidt and his buddy aren't around right now," Willis said. "They'd have heard you coming for miles." Mr. Hamilton nodded sheepishly. "You find anything yet?" "Not yet. You can leave your bike with ours, just around that last bend," Willis said. Eric restarted the machine for Mr. Hamilton and drove it down the trail to where they had hidden his own ATV and Willis's dirt bike. By the time he returned, Willis was heading back down the trail toward the clearing with his grandfather, the metal detector tucked under his left arm, his right hand holding the ledger from the tin box. Calvin had the large duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "We did find something," Willis said, holding the map up for his grandfather to see. "A map of the fort from the 1840s. "That could be useful," Mr. Hamilton agreed, taking the map for a closer look as they walked along. "Never knew there was a church in this village," he said. "Of course this was long before my time." Willis led them to the far side of the clearing. "This seems to be the spot where the church once stood," he said, pointing to the grass by their feet. "Doesn't look too promising," Calvin muttered, scanning the empty ground around them. Willis turned on the metal detector and began sweeping it across the ground in front of him. "Gotta start somewhere." Immediately the detector gave a series of short beeps. "Something here," Willis said, nudging the grass at his feet with the toe of his boot. "Appears to be a chunk of concrete." Calvin pulled the short-handled shovel from Willis's duffel bag and began to remove the soft black earth that surrounded the piece of cement. "It's bigger than it looks," he said, clearing away more and more of the dirt. It took several minutes before enough of the earth was removed and the object could be pulled from its shallow grave. "What is it?" Eric puffed as they hauled the large concrete block inch by inch from the ground. "There's something sticking out of the bottom." "No wonder it was so hard to get. Look at this." A large metal bar protruded from the bottom of the concrete block, a large rusted iron cross. "The cement must have been the base for the church's cross," Calvin said. Mr. Hamilton nodded in agreement. Willis and the boys studied the stand carefully. Willis rolled it over on the ground for a better look, then took out his penknife and began scratching the metal cross. "Just iron," he finally said. "Oh well," Calvin sighed. "Got our hopes up, didn't it?" "Maybe the treasure was buried under the cross," Eric said hopefully. "Let's check it out." He picked up Willis's metal detector and moved it over to the hole from which they had dug the stand. "Keep digging, Calvin," Willis said. "It could very well be a marker for something else buried farther down." Calvin was bending over to pick up the shovel when he had an overpowering feeling of being watched. He glanced at Willis. His friend was staring past Calvin and the others with a startled expression. Calvin whirled around. A few feet behind them, just stepping out from behind a bushy evergreen, was Schmidt, a broad smile on his face and a revolver in his right hand. "Good morning, gentlemen," Schmidt said. "How good to see you all again. I do hope you have made our task a little easier than it has been so far, because if you haven't, I shall be very displeased." As he spoke, his partner eased into the clearing behind him. A tight knot formed in the pit of Calvin's stomach as he looked down the barrel of the revolver. It was pointed directly at his head. Chapter 16. Tied up. With their hands tied securely behind them, Calvin, Eric and Mr. Hamilton were herded back to the closest wall of the old house. Willis had been tied and dumped on the ground a few feet from where Schmidt was busy digging. Calvin eyed the men across the clearing from them and strained against his ropes. Schmidt's partner looked their way every few seconds, but maybe he wouldn't notice. "Don't try anything cute," Schmidt's partner yelled, removing the revolver from his belt and brandishing it in their direction. "We're in for it now," Calvin said quietly. The knot in his stomach tightened as Schmidt's partner came striding across the clearing toward them. "Where is it?" The man's voice rose alarmingly. "You're holding something back. I'm sick and tired of this whole business, messing with an old man and a couple of kids." Calvin wondered if the man was about to come unglued. He stiffened his shoulders so they wouldn't tremble. "When we're finished with you, we'll put you where you ain't never going to be found." The man waved his revolver menacingly. "We don't know any more than you do," Mr. Hamilton said quietly. "You've got the map. In spite of all the fuss we're making, those gold coins may have been discovered 100 years ago." The man gave the bottom of Mr. Hamilton's feet a sharp kick. "Oh, the treasure's still here. I can feel it. And I know you're not telling us everything, but we'll find out. We're not done with you yet." He glared at Mr. Hamilton one last time, then walked back across the clearing to rejoin Schmidt. "What will they do to us when they're finished?" Eric asked. "Well," Mr. Hamilton said, "we are in a spot, no doubt about it. But things may not be as hopeless as they look." He fixed his gaze on the two boys. Calvin couldn't remember seeing the old man so serious. "The good Lord's still watching over us, boys. He knows what's going on." Eric struggled against the ropes binding his wrists. "It's easy for you to be calm," he said. Mr. Hamilton gave Eric a slight grin. "Oh, I may be old all right, but I'm still not too fussy about dying right this very minute." "You do seem pretty calm," Calvin said. "And what did you mean when you said that things might not be as hopeless as they seemed?" "Oh, I think you know what I mean, Cal. It's just that you don't necessarily believe it yet." "Believe what?" Calvin asked. "Well, what exactly are you afraid of?" Mr. Hamilton asked. "Getting killed," Calvin said in voice louder than he had intended. "And what is it about getting killed that bothers you?" Calvin thought for a minute. Across the clearing, Schmidt and his partner continued to dig. "I don't know," he finally said. "It's just scary, really scary." Eric spoke up. "Maybe it's not knowing where you'll be afterward." The old man adjusted his position against the side of the house. "What if you knew, really knew for sure?" Eric shook his head. "Nobody can know for sure where they'll end up." "Not so. In fact, the Bible was written so that we might know that we have eternal life. It says, 'These things have I written unto you, that you may know that you have eternal life.'" "But how can you know something like that for sure?" Calvin asked. There's no way to prove the Bible is true while we're still alive. And after we're dead, well, it's too late. God's word says that it all boils down to just one thing. We can either put our faith in ourselves or in His Son, and someday we'll come face to face with God. Tell me, are all the good things you've done during your life going to be enough to satisfy God? Eric shrugged. Mr. Hamilton continued, The Bible also says, For by grace are ye saved through faith. It is the gift of God, not of works. But we do believe in Jesus, Calvin said. Sort of. That may be true, but Jesus also taught that turning to Him also has to involve repentance. Repentance? That's right. Our sinful nature separates us from God. In our current condition, we couldn't enter heaven because we'd defile it. We must recognize that we can't save ourselves through our own righteousness, and we can't enter into heaven without our sins being forgiven. Calvin glanced nervously across the clearing. Schmidt and his partner were huddled together in an animated conference. Then what? He asked. Well, fellas, the old man said, remember the story I told you about chopping myself on the leg? The boys nodded. Well, what if I had been lying there, bleeding to death, my wife comes along to patch up my leg and take me to safety, and I tell her, no thanks, dear, I'll be all right, I can take care of myself. Calvin had to grin at that. Eric said, You wouldn't be here talking to us. Yes, and that's the difference between knowing about someone and what they can do, and actually putting your trust in that person. Jesus wants us to trust Him personally. We're separated from God by the sinful natures we are born with, and we can't hope to satisfy God's justice on our own. Trusting Christ to save us is like rolling onto that toboggan and letting someone pull you to safety. It's recognizing that only through Christ can we be accepted by God for eternity. Calvin adjusted his position against the wall of the house. I don't know, Mr. Hamilton. It sounds too simple. The old man nodded. It's simple, all right, but it's not easy. Christ paid for our sins with His life, and accepting His gift of forgiveness means you belong to Him. Sometimes that's not a bit easy. Silence fell, and Calvin was conscious of an odd sort of longing inside him. He lifted his face to the early morning sun and wished he were at home with both his parents. Finally he turned to the old man. I'd like to think about it some more, he said. What about you, Eric? Mr. Hamilton looked over at Eric's bowed head. Search your heart. Eric shook his head. Maybe later, he said. I just don't know what to think. Okay, fellas, the old man said. But I have to tell you, I know people who said later, but they never got around to it. Some of them never had a second chance. Calvin gave a sudden start. He had been so wrapped up in the conversation, he hadn't noticed Schmidt approaching them. We've run out of patience, Chief, Schmidt said, squatting on his heels in front of Mr. Hamilton. We didn't find anything where the cross was buried, so now it looks like we're going to have to get down to business. He jerked his thumb toward Willis. I understand the young fellow over there is your grandson. Mr. Hamilton stared right back at Schmidt. Yes, sir. That young man means more to me than anyone. But whatever you do to him, or threaten to do, will not change the fact that I don't know anything more about the treasure than you do. We shall see, Schmidt said. He hoisted Mr. Hamilton up by the front of his shirt and pushed him against the building. Bring the grandson over here, he ordered. The other man dragged Willis across the clearing and pushed him up onto the porch. Keep an eye on those guys, Schmidt said, walking quickly over to their ATV. A moment later he returned with a large red gasoline can. Get him inside the house, he snapped, pointing to Willis. We'll soon see how much Sitting Bull really knows. What are you going to do? Eric asked. Schmidt paused on the bottom step of the dilapidated porch. He waved the gas can in front of them. "Why, it's a perfect day for a little bonfire, don't you think?" A strange smile spread slowly across his face. "And we have a special guest, Geronimo here." He gave Willis a shove up the steps. On the porch, Willis turned to face Schmidt. "I know where the treasure is," he said simply. Schmidt stopped in his tracks and everything grew quiet. "You know where the treasure is?" Schmidt asked, moving closer. Schmidt's partner gave Willis a shove. "Where?" "First, untie my grandfather," Willis said quietly. The two men looked at each other. "You're in no position to dictate terms to us," Schmidt said. "We're about to toast you like a marshmallow." "Then I guess I'm toast," Willis said, turning back toward the front door. Schmidt leaped up on the steps and yanked him around by the shoulder. "What if we burn the old man instead of you?" Willis was silent for a moment. "You do, and I'll make absolutely sure you never find the treasure." "Untie the old man," Schmidt barked, pointing his revolver in Mr. Hamilton's direction. "But kill him if he tries anything funny." Grumbling, Schmidt's partner shuffled around behind Mr. Hamilton and sliced the ropes binding his wrists. "Now, where is it?" Schmidt said, his eyes narrowing. Willis, his hands still bound, moved slowly back down the porch steps and across the clearing to where they had found the iron cross. Calvin, Eric, and Mr. Hamilton followed cautiously. Willis waited until everyone had gathered around him. Then he nudged the piece of concrete with his foot. "In there," he said. They mixed the gold coins in with the cement. "The swirling picture in the rock paintings," Eric said, his eyes widening. "That was a picture of the cement being mixed." "Get the axe from the ATV," Schmidt said to his partner. The man turned and sprinted across the clearing to the vehicle. In a moment he returned with a large axe and handed it to Schmidt. "Let's see just what's in here, if anything." Schmidt raised the axe over his head and brought the back of it down on the cement base, sending several fragments into the air. He grunted and rubbed a hand on his pants. "This may take some time." "Let me try," the other man broke in, handing the revolver to Schmidt and taking the axe from his partner's hands. Schmidt's partner rained blow after blow down on the rock-hard concrete. Small chunks began to break off from the main body of the base, and after one more violent swing, the base split wide open. Schmidt and his partner dropped to their knees, pushing the largest piece over on its back. Several gold pieces glittered from the broken concrete. "The treasure!" Schmidt gasped. "We found it! It's really here!" Chapter 17. Hurry up. Calvin moved forward to get a better look. Schmidt glanced up, waving his revolver in their faces. "They did mix the gold coins in with the concrete," he said. "It's been here all these years." He turned to his partner. "Break the cement into smaller pieces so we can fit it into our pack-sack. We'll get the coins out later." The man nodded, then he pointed the axe in Willis's direction. "What do we do with them?" "We get rid of them once and for all," Schmidt said. "If no one knows we found the treasure, then they can't mess things up later with their accusations. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Hurry up and smash the concrete. I'll take these guys over to the house. I've got an idea." He waved his revolver at Calvin and the others. "Come on!" He pushed Mr. Hamilton in the direction of the old building. "No funny stuff, old man. When my buddy's finished, we'll get you tied back up. Then we'll have ourselves a little bonfire." Schmidt led them up the porch steps and into the house, motioning them into a corner on the far side of the room. As the four prisoners slumped to the floor, Calvin took a quick look around. There were just 3 solid walls and a rough board floor. The closest window was halfway across the room. Schmidt stood in the doorway, keeping one eye on his prisoners and the other on his partner. From across the clearing they could hear the axe crashing into the concrete block again and again. "Keep your hands where I can see them, old man," Schmidt ordered. Mr. Hamilton eased himself into a sitting position close to Calvin. "Hurry up!" Schmidt yelled in his partner's direction. In that instant, Mr. Hamilton's hand flicked out behind Calvin's back. Calvin felt a slight jerk. The rope binding his wrists dropped onto the floor behind him. Calvin kept his wrists where they were, glancing at the man in the doorway. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Mr. Hamilton's left foot move ever so slightly, his toe pointing to a spot on the floor in front of them. Calvin stared at the rough grey floorboards, trying to make out what his friend was showing him. Finally, he noticed the faint outline of a square before him, the trap door. "Hurry up, will you?" Schmidt shouted, taking a few steps down the porch. "We don't have all day." In a flash, the old man was on his knees, sticking the blade of his jackknife into the crack in the floor. Carefully, he eased the trap door up, revealing a black opening at their feet. He grabbed Calvin's arm and pushed him toward the hole, directing him down beneath the floorboards. Then he slid noiselessly in behind. The trap door closed silently above their heads. "Hurry," Mr. Hamilton whispered. Calvin dove toward a gap in the foundation ahead of them, ducking under the floor joists and crawling as fast as he could. Above them, Schmidt's footsteps thumped on the porch. Calvin scrambled the last few feet and poked his head out between the crumbling stones. He found himself looking out over the meadow behind the house. He squeezed past the stones and helped the old man through. "What now?" he whispered. "Follow me." Crouching, Mr. Hamilton sprinted towards some trees about 50 yards away. As Calvin followed, he realized that the old man had cleverly put the house between themselves and Schmidt's partner. Suddenly they could hear Schmidt screaming. "The old man and the boy! They're gone! Get in here, check upstairs. They've got to be in the building. I had the door and windows covered." In the small grove of birch trees, Mr. Hamilton headed for Schmidt's red ATV. "Are we going to make a break for it on the bike?" Calvin asked. "Go for help?" "Take too long. By the time we got back, Willis and Eric would be long gone." Mr. Hamilton reached into the engine and yanked out a spark plug wire. "That'll ground them for a while," he said. "Come on." Calvin glanced quickly back at the house. Schmidt was just rounding the far corner. "There's nothing out here," he shouted back to his partner. "Check upstairs." As Calvin followed Mr. Hamilton deeper into the woods, he soon found how difficult it was to keep up with the fast pace of the older man. "Where are we going?" he gasped when they finally stopped in a dense thicket of balsam trees. "I need you to do something for me, Cal." Mr. Hamilton didn't seem to be out of breath at all. "But you've got to be careful. Circle around and get as close to the house as you can. I'm going to provide a bit of a distraction. When I do, I want you to get into that house and cut Willis and Eric loose." He handed Calvin his jackknife. "Meet me back where we left the ATVs, and be careful." With that, the old man turned and headed off through the brush in his peculiar stooped-over running style. Calvin slipped the jackknife into his pocket and loped off through the trees in the direction of the clearing. A few minutes later, he was crouching among a clump of birch trees a stone's throw from the old house. Schmidt and his partner were standing on the porch. "I told you not to untie that old man," Schmidt's partner was shouting. "He's too sneaky. Now look what happened." "Never mind, just make sure—" Schmidt's voice trailed off as he stared across the clearing to where they had just dug up the iron cross. "What on earth?" Mr. Hamilton was sprinting from the bush toward the site of their recent excavation. In one quick motion he snatched up the packsack and fled back into the trees. "He grabbed our gold!" Schmidt's partner shouted in disbelief. "Hurry!" Schmidt shouted. "If he gets much of a head start, we'll never catch that old fox in these woods." He waved at their remaining captives. "They'll be okay. I tied up their legs too." He dashed out across the field, checking the ammunition in his gun as he ran. Calvin waited until the two men were halfway across the clearing before he left the shelter of the birch trees. Then he ran into the house. "Come on, guys, let's get out of here." He dashed across the room, sliding the last few feet on his knees. "Calvin!" Quickly he cut the ropes binding his friend's wrists and ankles. Willis scrambled to his feet. "We've got to get out there. Grandad's really got himself into trouble." "No, it's okay," Calvin said. "We're to meet him by the ATVs. Come on." He led the way back out the door and onto the porch, glanced in both directions, and sprinted across the clearing to the trail leading away from the fort. "Please help us, God," he prayed silently. Just a few more feet, then down the trail, onto our bikes, and we're home free. A shout. Someone was shouting from the other end of the clearing. "There they go!" It was Schmidt's voice. "They got away!" A shot rang out, and Calvin heard a dull thud to his right as a slug smashed into a tree. Then they were into the thick bush and hidden momentarily from their pursuers. "Quick, quick!" Willis urged as they ran. "We've got to reach the ATVs and start them before Schmidt gets too close." Willis seemed to find new energy as they raced down the winding path, and it was everything Calvin could do to keep up. When they finally stumbled into the small glade where they had left their bikes, Calvin thought for sure his lungs would burst. "Mr. Hamilton's not here yet," Eric shouted as Willis kicked his motorcycle into action. "He'll be all right," Willis yelled above the roar. "Get one of those things started and let's go." Willis's bike was beginning to roll out onto the trail when a lone figure with a large pack-sack broke through the trees and leaped onto Mr. Hamilton's ATV. "You heard the man. Let's go," Mr. Hamilton shouted. Eric jumped onto the back of Willis's machine and Calvin piled on with Mr. Hamilton. Both drivers gunned their engines and tore off down the trail, throwing up a cloud of dust and pine needles. Calvin held onto the driver for dear life. "We left Eric's ATV," Calvin shouted to Mr. Hamilton. He reached around behind him to pull the old man's pack-sack more securely onto the machine and noticed Schmidt dash into the clearing. Schmidt aimed the revolver, and it bucked slightly in the man's hand, but Calvin couldn't hear the gun above the roar of the machine. Mr. Hamilton suddenly flinched and sagged in the seat in front of him. "You okay?" Calvin shouted. The old man glanced back at Calvin and nodded. "He'll be coming after us on Eric's ATV." Calvin eased himself away from Mr. Hamilton to get a better look at the driver. He sucked in his breath. A large red patch was spreading across Mr. Hamilton's shirt, midway down the old man's side. Chapter 18. The Final Conflict. The dark red stain on Mr. Hamilton's shirt spread rapidly as the ATV bumped along the path through the forest. Calvin reached his arms around the old man and took hold of the handlebars, allowing his friend to lean backward against him. "Wish I'd had a chance to pull a spark plug out of that last machine," Mr. Hamilton muttered. "Never mind," Calvin said. "We'll get away." Soon he could feel the old man's body pressing heavily against him as they followed the winding path. How far was it back to the road? Although there was still no sign of pursuit, Calvin knew that Schmidt wouldn't be far behind. He reached behind them once more and pulled the pack-sack filled with the concrete pieces closer to him. Willis's glances back at them were taking on a more worried look. He must realize that something was definitely wrong with his grandfather, Calvin thought. Willis slowed his dirt bike as they approached a bushy spruce tree growing beside the trail. Then he veered off the pathway and disappeared behind the thick foliage. Somehow Calvin managed to hit the brake, and they skidded off the path behind Willis and Eric. "What happened?" Willis asked, pulling his grandfather gently from the ATV and laying him on the forest floor. "He was shot," Calvin said. Willis paled at the sight of the large bloodstain. "You gonna be okay for a few minutes, Granddad?" he asked. "We'll get you to a doctor real quick, But first we gotta get rid of those two guys following us." He brushed the old man's hair away from his forehead and smiled at him. Mr. Hamilton managed to nod his head. "Do what you gotta do, Will," he said. Willis turned to Eric. "Can you try to stop the bleeding?" Eric dropped down beside the injured man. Willis touched the old man's hand gently, then jumped to his feet. He mounted his grandfather's idling ATV and eased it up behind the spruce tree to the edge of the trail. With his left hand he squeezed down on the brake, and with his right he revved the engine to an ear-splitting crescendo. Above the racket, Calvin could hear the sound of the approaching ATV. He peered through the thick branches as the vehicle accelerated around a bend in the trail 100 yards away. A split second before Schmidt's vehicle shot past them, Willis released the brake, and his machine jumped forward with a roar. The front of Willis's ATV met the oncoming bike with a resounding crash, hurtling the two passengers over the handlebars and into some bushes several feet away. In a flash, Willis leapt from the machine and pounced on the closest man. "Grab the other guy!" he shouted. Calvin and Eric raced past Willis to where Schmidt was lying motionless on his face. Willis pulled Schmidt's partner roughly to his feet, at the same time checking his pockets for the revolver. His prisoner cried out in pain, and his legs buckled under him. "Look for the gun!" Willis yelled at the boys. "It's not here!" Calvin and Eric rolled Schmidt onto his back. In an instant he was on his feet, shoving Eric violently backward, swinging a punch at Calvin's face. He staggered backwards. "Get him!" Calvin yelled. With 3 quick strides, Willis was on top of Schmidt, his momentum propelling both of them through a tangle of small trees. "Find that gun!" Willis shouted back at the two boys. The snub-nosed revolver had landed in the brush just beyond where the two men had been thrown. Calvin grabbed it and pointed it towards Schmidt. Willis straddled Schmidt's chest, his knees pinning the other man's arms beneath them. "Okay, Willis, you can let him up now," Calvin said. Willis climbed to his feet and retrieved the gun from Calvin. "Get over by the other guy," he said to Schmidt. Schmidt got up from the ground, rubbing his shoulders. He looked over at Mr. Hamilton's prone form. "What's wrong with the old man?" "You shot him!" Eric shouted. Schmidt seemed surprised. "I hit him." "You hit him all right," Willis said, kneeling back down beside his grandfather. "Get them both tied up," he said. He pointed the revolver at Schmidt. "And if you try anything, you're going to be a lot worse off than he is." Eric cut a couple of short lengths from a coil of rope on the ATV and bound their prisoners' wrists tightly behind their backs. Willis knelt down beside his grandfather, cradling the old man's head in his lap. "You'll be okay," Willis murmured. "We'll get you out of here, get you to a doctor. Just hang in there." His grandfather's eyes flickered open, and he looked up at his grandson. "Not this time, Will," he whispered. "Sorry to make things even tougher for you guys than they've already been, but it does look like you've got things under control now." Mr. Hamilton glanced over at Calvin and Eric. "Cal, it's time you settled things with the Lord, don't you think?" Calvin dropped to his knees by the old man. "I'm ready now," he said simply. Mr. Hamilton placed a hand on Calvin's. "I can help you with the words, son," he said weakly. "Say this to the Lord, Heavenly Father. I know I'm a sinner in desperate need of salvation. I believe that Jesus died on the cross as a payment for my sins. I place my faith and trust in the finished work of the Lord Jesus Christ today. Amen." Calvin prayed in a halting voice. Then he gazed down at Mr. Hamilton. The old man was smiling at him. Mr. Hamilton looked at Calvin's cousin. "And you, Eric?" Eric started to speak, then paused. He shook his head. The old man sighed. "Eric, my boy, don't wait too long. Tomorrow may be too late. We don't know from day to day which will be our last. I never expected to be meeting the Lord today, but I'm sure I will be, and it's something I've looked forward to for a long time." He motioned for his grandson to come closer. "And Will, you once made a commitment to Jesus, but for the last few years you've put him on a back burner, haven't you?" Willis nodded, his face drawn and grim. "I hope you'll put him in first place again, Will." He reached out and touched Willis's cheek, then his eyes closed, and he gave a long sigh. "We've got to get some help in here," Willis said. He looked around, as if trying to find something that would get them out of their difficulty. "We can't take him on the ATV," Calvin said. "He's too weak." Slowly, Mr. Hamilton lifted his hand and placed it on his grandson's sleeve. "Never mind trying to go for help. I'd like to spend my last few minutes like this, with the three of you." Willis glanced over at Schmidt and the other man. Both prisoners were sitting with their backs against the spruce tree, watching. Somewhere in the forest a pair of blue jays chattered noisily back and forth and insects chirred. Calvin looked down at Mr. Hamilton's ashen face. The old man appeared to be drifting in and out of consciousness now, his breathing shallow, his expression peaceful. Eric picked up the old man's hand and held it in both of his. Calvin felt the stillness of the northern wilderness close down upon him. The excitement of the last few days faded as he pondered the events that really mattered, meeting Willis and his grandfather, coming to terms with the Lord Jesus Christ. Just think, he had only known Ed Hamilton for the last few days of the old man's long, eventful life. And it had all ended this way on account of a bunch of gold coins, hardly worth the life of this wonderful man. He looked again at the man lying in the shadow of the great spruce tree. Then he noticed that the old man's chest no longer rose and fell beneath his blood-stained shirt. Willis drew the old man's body against his chest and held it to him for the last time. Epilogue. A breath of summer's wind. The last rays of the setting sun sparkled across Lake Kenogami as Calvin and Eric sat in silence on the end of the dock. A week had passed since their adventures at Fort Thunderbird, and Calvin was getting used to the quiet moments between them. Aunt Helga closed the screen door of the lodge gently behind her and walked across the yard to the dock. "Evening, boys." "Evening, Aunt Helga," Calvin said with a smile. "This is something I don't think I'll ever get tired of," she said, breathing deeply of the evening air as she looked out across the lake. "Been a tough summer for you boys so far, hasn't it?" she finally said. They looked up at her but said nothing. "I sure don't think old Mr. Hamilton would be all that pleased if he knew you were moping around like this." "It's not that, Mom," Eric said. "It's just that he left us with a lot to think about." "I know," she said. "I also see you both reading your Bibles lately. I guess that has something to do with his influence too, doesn't it?" Calvin nodded, and a small smile appeared on Eric's face. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke the stillness. "Oops, looks like someone's here," Aunt Helga said, starting back toward the lodge. "Oh, it's Willis. Now, you boys don't stay out too late. I need you for work tomorrow." Willis sauntered down from his truck, carrying a large pack-sack. "Howdy, Willis," Eric said. "You just get back from the city?" Willis joined his two friends on the end of the dock. "Just came in on the Northlander, boys. It was early for a change. Picked you both up a present." He opened up the pack-sack and drew out two large, flat boxes. "How did things go in Toronto?" Calvin asked. "Never mind. Just open them up," Willis said. Calvin and Eric lifted the lids of their respective boxes. "I got you each the same thing," Willis explained, "so you wouldn't get jealous." Calvin peered into his box. "Fishing rods?" Eric asked. "Yeah, the collapsible kind. I noticed the ones you had were pretty ratty." "Very smart looking," Calvin said, fitting his rod together. "You'll have to use your old reels, though," Willis said. "There wasn't that much money from the treasure for you two." Calvin looked up in surprise. "They got all the coins out of the concrete?" Eric asked. The coins were in excellent condition. Most had been wrapped in moosehide pouches for protection. Quite a tidy sum, too, when it was all said and done. "Did you tell the lawyers what we suggested the money be used for?" Calvin asked. "Sure did. A trust fund has already been set up to give the native people around here a real second wind, so to speak. There is a downside to it, though. The lawyer insisted I help to oversee the whole deal. I'm supposed to set up a committee of local natives who will make the decisions on choosing what projects to support, ideas that will provide our people with retraining opportunities and jobs in their home communities." "Can't think of a better man for the job," Calvin said. Willis grinned. "Course not." "What about Schmidt and his pal?" Eric asked. "They'll stand trial for murder. The Crown Attorney will be talking to you before long, I'm sure." "And the Tullocks?" Eric asked. "Have they turned up yet?" Willis laughed. "Oh, yes. In fact, they gave me some help with dating and evaluating the coins. It was like we figured. They had skedaddled back home, and it was Schmidt and his buddy who scared them off. They were very apologetic about not calling to let us know what happened." For several minutes no one said anything. Calvin sat there, looking out over the surface of the lake, watching the sun disappear behind the trees on the western shore. Finally, he took a deep breath and turned to Willis. "Have you given much thought to what your grandfather said to us just before he died?" Willis paused for a moment, his brow furrowing. "Been thinking about it all my life," he said. "Been running away from it too, for the most part. I guess it's time to do something about it. No more pesky old man nagging me, being my conscience." He glanced over at Eric. "What about you, Eric? What kind of a decision have you come up with?" Eric looked down at the water at his feet and sighed, still thinking it over. "That's called sitting on the fence," Willis said. "I ought to know." He picked up Eric's new fishing rod. "When I offered you this fishing pole, what two choices did you have?" Eric looked over at his friend with a puzzled expression. "Take it or not, I guess. Same thing when God offers us a gift, is it not?" Eric nodded his head slowly. "I suppose." "Fence-sitting is the same thing as saying no, Eric." Willis put one of his big hands on Eric's shoulder. "Like the old man said, give it careful thought, but don't spend your whole life thinking it over, or you may never get up the gumption to come to God on his terms and accept his free gift." Willis rose to his feet. "Think about it." "I will." Calvin got up from the dock and took a last look across the still surface of Lake Kenogami. He thought again of his parents, miles away in the city, and the lonely hurt returned. But with the ache, he knew that now there was someone to help him face whatever the future held. Someone to see him through the troubled days ahead. The warm evening breeze played gently against his face. He sighed and turned to his two friends. "Like a breath of summer's wind. Isn't that how your grandfather described life?" Willis nodded. "A breath of summer's wind," he repeated. "And gone,